So, we're going to do a little Locke stream. I can't do anything else with my life until I finish this book. That's it. That's the only thing I can do. And that's a reprieve, you know. I don't have to choose. I don't have to think. I don't have to doubt. I don't have to wonder if what I'm doing is good or bad or worthwhile or not worthwhile because I know. I know exactly what it is. It is what it is. It is nothing else but what it is. And I'm resigned. I am resigned to this. Wow, this is so boring. Why are you doing this? You know, we just committed to it. We just said we're going to do it. It's like when you do your exercises. It's sort of an exercise in pessimism, right? It's like, well, I might as well do it, right? I might as well. Let's see. I might as well. I mean, what happens either way? What happens if I do an entertaining stream versus this kind of a stream? Does anything good happen? Does anything bad happen? It just is what it is. Simply is what it is. And people continue to tune in. People should just tune out. People should just ignore and just let it be. We should have 0 views. We should have no views. If this is truly worthless, if this is nothing, we should have 0 views. No one should be watching. So what's going on? This is confusing. What does this tell us about society and human nature that people are tuning in? What does this tell us about the state of mankind? The last man, you know. We are the last man. They say when you read Nietzsche, you always think you're the Ubermensch. You know, when I read Nietzsche, I identify with the last man. I'm like, how can I mobilize priestly super sovereignties to increase my comfort in these times? So here we are with that lovely, powerful, positive introduction. We have to finish Locke. We are on page 197, and we just have to power through. And we just have to keep reading like a, what shall we call it? Like a robot, like a automaton, like an animal. Gotta step aside here. Gotta adjust myself. Because we gotta get comfy for this. We gotta get comfy for this reading. Gotta make sure we're stretched. Gotta make sure we're cracked. That we're ready. So where are we? I think we probably stopped at number 25. Talking about Japan, talking about the different lengths, the names of inches, feet, and miles, the notion of extension and different measurements, the account of time and the notion of duration. Text-to-speech machine. Yeah, that is essentially what I am. I am a text-to-speech machine. I am unable to discern. I'm unable to read the Cliff Notes or the Wikipedia. I have to interact directly with the source material. I can't skim it. I can't have a discussion about it. I can't do anything but deal exactly with the thing itself. I'm reduced to an analytic automaton. I'm becoming one with the internet. I'm exhausting my human agency. You know, in some sense, you could say this is an exercise of self-control, but in another sense, I am completely devoid of self-control. I am not an agent. I am simply the passive recipient of Locke. I exit my own body. I excavate it of its organs, and I invite the text to come into my body to fill me up so that I am like a stuffed dog, so that I'm like a dog who has died, and the owner has taken the pages of an essay concerning human understanding. He's taken those pages and he's stuffed me full so that I can sit pretty in your living room, projected by a YouTube stream. So that is the wonderful situation we have going on. Next up, Gurdjieff. Maybe Gurdjieff. I'm probably going to do Hume next, to be honest, if we want to be completely honest about this. But I'm open to people incentivizing me. I'm open to being incentivized if someone wants me to read something. So we're talking about the measures of time applicable to duration before time, the mind having once got such a measure of time as the annual revolution of the sun can apply that measure to duration, wherein that measure itself did not exist, and with which, in the reality of its being, it had nothing to do. For should one say that Abraham was born in the 2712th year of the Julian period, it is altogether as intelligible as reckoning from the beginning of the world, though there were so far back no motion of the sun nor any other motion at all. For though the Julian period be supposed to begin several hundred years before there were really either days, nights, or years marked out by any revolutions of the sun, yet we reckon as right, and thereby measure duration as well, as if really at that time the sun had existed and kept the same ordinary motion it doth now. The idea of duration equal to an annual revolution of the sun is as easily applicable in our thoughts to duration where no sun nor motion was, as the idea of a foot or yard taken from bodies here can be applied in our thoughts to distances beyond the confines of the world where there are no bodies at all. For supposing it were 5,639 miles or millions of miles from this place to the remotest body of the universe, for being finite it must be at a certain distance, as we suppose it to be 5,639 years, from this time to the first existence of any body in the beginning of the world, we can in our thoughts apply this measure of a year to duration before the creation, or beyond the duration of bodies or motion, as we can this measure of a mile to space beyond the utmost bodies, and by the one measure duration where there was no motion, as well as by the other measure space in our thoughts where there is no body. If it be objected to me here that in this way of explaining of time I have begged what I should not, vis-a-vis that the world is neither eternal nor infinite, I answer that to my present purpose it is not needful in this place to make use of arguments to evince the world to be finite both in duration and extension, but it being at least as conceivable as the contrary, I have certainly the liberty to suppose it as well as anyone hath to suppose the contrary, and I doubt not but that every one that will go about it may easily conceive in his mind the beginning of motion, though not of all duration, and so may come to a stop and non ultra in his consideration of motion, so also in his thoughts he may set limits to body in the extension belonging to it, but not to space where no body is, the utmost bounds of space and duration being beyond the reach of thought, as well as the utmost bounds of number are beyond the largest comprehension of the mind, and all for the same reason, as we shall see in another place. By the same means, therefore, and from the same original that we come to have the idea of time, we have also that idea which we call eternity, vis-a-vis having got the idea of succession and duration by reflecting on the train of our ideas caused in us either by the natural appearances of those ideas coming constantly of themselves in our waking thoughts, or else caused by external objects successively affecting our senses, and having from the revolution of the sun got the ideas of certain lengths of duration, we can in our thoughts in such lengths of duration to one another as often as we please, and apply them so added to durations past or to come, and this we can continue to do on without bounds or limits, and proceed in infinitum, and apply thus the length of the annual motion of the sun to duration, supposed before the sun's or any other motion had its being, which is not more difficult or absurd than to apply the notion I have of the moving of a shadow 1 hour today on the sundial to the duration of something last night, v.g. the burning of a candle, which is now absolutely separate from all actual motion, and it is as impossible for the duration of that flame for an hour last night to coexist with any motion that now is, or forever shall be, as for any part of duration that was before the beginning of the world to coexist with the motion of the sun now. But yet this hinders not, but that having the idea of the length of the motion of the shadow on a dial between the marks of 2 hours, I can as distinctly measure in my thoughts the duration of that candle light last night, as I can the duration of anything that does now exist, and it is no more than to think that the sun shone then on the dial and moved after the same rate it doth now, the shadow on the dial would have passed from one hour line to another whilst the flame of the candle lasted. The notion of an hour, day, or year being only the idea I have of the length of certain periodical regular motions, neither of which motions do ever at all once exist, but only in the ideas I have of them in my memory derived from my senses of reflection, I can with the same ease and for the same reason apply it in my thoughts to duration antecedent to all manner of motion, as well as to anything that is but a minute or a day antecedent to the motion that at this very moment the sun is in. All things past are equally and perfectly at rest, and to this way of consideration of them are all one, whether they were before the beginning of the world or but yesterday, the measuring of any duration by some motion, depending not at all on the real coexistence of that thing to that motion, or any other periods of revolution, but the having a clear idea of the length of some periodical known motion, or other intervals of duration in my mind, and applying that to the duration of the thing I would measure. Hence we see that some men imagine the duration of the world from its first existence to this present year, 1689, to have been 5,639 years, or equal to 5,639 annual revolutions of the sun, and others a great deal more, as the Egyptians of old, who in the time of Alexander counted 23,000 years from the reign of the sun, and the Chinese now, who account the world 3,269,000 years old or more, which longer duration of the world, according to the computation, though I should not believe it to be true, yet I can equally imagine it with them as truly understand and say one is longer than the other, as they understand that Methuselah's life was longer than Enoch's, and if the common reckoning of 5,639 should be true, as it may, as well as any other assigned, it hinders not at all my imagining what others mean when they make the world 1,000 years older, since everyone may with the same facility imagine, I do not say believe, the world to be 50,000 years old as 5,639, and may as well conceive the duration of 50,000 years as 5639, whereby it appears that to the measuring the duration of anything by time, it is not requisite that the thing should be coexistent to the motion we measure by, or any other periodical revolution, but it suffices to this purpose that we have the idea of the length of any regular periodical appearances, which we can in our minds apply to duration, with which the motion or appearance never coexisted. For as in the history of the creation delivered by Moses, I can imagine that light existed 3 days before the sun was, or had any motion barely by thinking that the duration of light before the sun was created was so long as, if the sun had moved then as it doth now, would have been equal to 3 of his diurnal revolutions. So by the same way I can have an idea of the chaos or angels being created before there was either light or any continued motion, a minute, an hour, a day, a year, or 1,000 years. For if I can but consider duration equal to 1 minute before either the being or motion of any body, I can add 1 minute more till I come to 60, and by the same way of adding minutes, hours, or years, i.e. such or such parts of the sun's revolution, or any other period whereof I have the idea, proceed in infinitum, and suppose a duration exceeding as many such periods as I can reckon, let me add whilst I will, which I think is the notion we have of eternity, of whose infinity we have no other notion than we have of the infinity of number, to which we can add forever without end. And thus I think it is plain that from those two fountains of all knowledge before mentioned, vis-a-vis reflection and sensation, we get the ideas of duration and the measures of it. For first, by observing what passes in our minds, how our ideas there in train constantly some vanish and others begin to appear, we come by the idea of succession. Secondly, by observing a distance in the parts of this succession, we get the idea of duration. Thirdly, by sensation observing certain appearances at certain regular and seeming equidistant periods, we get the ideas of certain lengths or measures of duration as minutes, hours, days, years, etc. Fourthly, by being able to repeat those measures of time or ideas of stated length of duration in our minds as often as we will, we can come to imagine duration where nothing does really endure or exist, and thus we imagine tomorrow, next year, or 7 years hence. Fifthly, by being able to repeat any such idea of any length of time, as of a minute, a year, or an age, as often as we will in our own thoughts, and add them one to another, without ever coming to the end of such addition any nearer than we can to the end of number, to which we can always add, we come by the idea of eternity as the future eternal duration of our souls, as well as the eternity of that infinite being which must necessarily have always existed. Sixthly, by considering any part of infinite duration as set out by periodical measures, we come by the idea of what we call time in general. Chapter 15 of duration and expansion considered together, both capable of greater and less. Though we have in the precedent chapters dwelt pretty long on the considerations of space and duration, yet they being ideas of general concernment that have something very abstruse and peculiar in their nature, that comparing them one with another may perhaps be of use for their illustration, and we may have the more clear and distinct conception of them by taking a view of them together. Distance or space in the simple abstract conception, to avoid confusion, I call expansion, to distinguish it from extension, which by some is used to express the distance only as it is in the solid parts of matter, and so includes, or at least intimates, the idea of body, whereas the idea of pure distance includes no such thing. I also prefer the word expansion to space, because space is often applied to distance of fleeting successive parts which never exist together, as well as to those which are permanent. In both these, vis-a-vis expansion and duration, the mind has this common idea of continued lengths, capable of greater or less quantities, for a man has as clear an idea of the difference of the length of an hour and a day as of an inch and a foot. The mind having gotten the idea of the length of any part of expansion, let it be a span or a pace, or what length you will, can, as has been said, repeat that idea, and so adding it to the former, enlarge its idea of length, and make it equal to 2 spans or 2 paces, and so often as it will, till it equal the distance of any parts of the earth one from another, and increase thus till it amounts to the distance of the sun or remotest star. By such a progression as this, setting out from the place where it is, or any other place, it can proceed and pass beyond all those lengths, and find nothing to stop its going on, either in or without the body. 'Tis true, we can easily in our thoughts come to the end of solid extension, the extremity and bounds of all body. We have no difficulty to arrive at, but when the mind is there, it finds nothing to hinder its progress into this endless expansion. Of that it can neither find nor conceive any end. Nor let anyone say that beyond the bounds of body there is nothing at all, unless he will confine God within the limits of matter. Solomon, whose understanding was filled and enlarged with wisdom, seems to have other thoughts when he says, heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain thee. And he, I think, very much magnifies to himself the capacity of his own understanding, who persuades himself that he can extend his thoughts farther than God exists, or imagine any expansion where he is not. So this is nominalism. Just so is it in duration. The mind, having got the idea of any length of duration, can double, multiply, and enlarge it, not only beyond its own, but beyond the existence of all corporeal beings, and all the measures of time taken from the great bodies of the world and their motions. But yet everyone easily admits that though we can make duration boundless, as certainly it is, we cannot yet extend it beyond all being. God, everyone easily allows, fills eternity, and 'tis hard to find a reason why anyone should doubt that he likewise fills immensity. His infinite being is certainly as boundless one way as another, and methinks it ascribes a little too much to matter to say, where there is no body, there is nothing. Hence I think we may learn the reason why everyone familiarly and without the least hesitation speaks of and supposes eternity, and sticks not to ascribe infinity to duration, but 'tis with more doubting and reserve that many admit or suppose the infinity of space. The reason whereof seems to me to be this, that duration and extension being used as names of affection belonging to other beings, we can easily conceive God in infinite duration, and we cannot avoid doing so. But not attributing to him extension, but only to matter which is finite, we are apter to doubt of the existence of expansion without matter, of which alone we commonly suppose it an attribute. And therefore when men pursue their thoughts of space, they are apt to stop at the confines of body, as if space were there at an end too, and reach no farther. Or if their ideas upon consideration carry them farther, yet they term what is beyond the limits of the universe imaginary space, as if it were nothing, because there is no body existing in it. whereas duration antecedent to all body and to the motion which it is measured by, they never term imaginary, because it is never supposed void of some other real existence. And if the names of things may at all direct our thoughts toward the originals of men's ideas, as I am apt to think that they may very much, one may have occasion to think by the name of duration that the continuation of existence with a kind of resistance to any destructive force, and the continuation of solidity, which is apt to be confounded with, and if we look into the minute anatomical parts of matter, is little different from hardness, were thought to have some analogy, and gave occasion to words so near of kin as durare and durum esse, and that durare is applied to the idea of hardness as well as that of existence, we see in Horace Epod 16 ferro duravit secula. But be that as it will, this is certain, that whoever pursues his own thoughts will find them sometimes launch out beyond the extent of body into the infinity of space or expansion, the idea whereof is distinct and separate from body, and all of the other things, which may, to those who please, be a subject of farther meditation. Time in general is to duration as places to expansion. There is so much of those boundless oceans of eternity and immensity as is set out and distinguished from the rest, as it were by landmarks, and so are made use of to denote the position of finite real beings in respect one to another in those uniform infinite oceans of duration and space. These, rightly considered, are nothing but ideas of determinate distances from certain known points, fixed indistinguishable sensible things, and supposed to keep the same distance one from another. From such points fixed in sensible beings we reckon, and from them we measure our portions of those infinite quantities, which so considered are that which we call time and place. For duration and space being in themselves uniform and boundless, the order and position of things, without such known settled points, would be lost in them, and all things would lie jumbled in an incurable confusion. Time and place taken thus for determinate, distinguishable portions of those infinite abysses of space and duration, set out or supposed to be distinguished from the rest by marks and known boundaries, have each of them a twofold acceptation. First, time in general is commonly taken for so much of infinite duration as is measured out by and coexistent with the existence and motions of the great bodies of the universe, as far as we know anything of them. And in this sense, time begins and ends with the frame of this sensible world, as in these phrases before mentioned, before all time, or when time shall be no more. Place likewise is taken sometimes for that portion of infinite space which is possessed by and comprehended within the material world, and is thereby distinguished from the rest of expansion, though this may more properly be called extension than place. Within these two are confined, and by the observable parts of them are measured and determined the particular time or duration and the particular extension and place of all corporeal beings. Secondly, sometimes the word time is used in a larger sense and is applied to parts of that infinite duration, not that were really distinguished and measured out by this real existence and periodical motions of bodies that were appointed from the beginning to be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and are accordingly our measures of time, but such other proportions too of that infinite uniform duration which we upon any occasion do suppose equal to certain lengths of measured time, and so consider them as bounded and determined. For if we should suppose the creation or fall of the angels was at the beginning of the Julian period, we should speak properly enough, and should be understood if we said, 'tis a longer time since the creation of angels than the creation of the world by 764 years, whereby we would mark out so much of that undistinguished duration as we suppose equal to, and would have admitted 764 annual revolutions of the sun moving at the rate it now does. And thus likewise, we sometimes speak of place, distance, or bulk in the great inane beyond the confines of the world, when we consider so much of that space as is equal to or capable to receive a body of any assigned dimensions as a cubic foot, or do suppose a point in it at such certain distance from any part of the universe. where and when are questions belonging to all finite existences, and are by us always reckoned from some unknown parts of this sensible world, and from some certain epochs marked out to us by the motions observable in it. Without some such fixed parts or periods, the order of things would be lost to our infinite understandings in the boundless invariable oceans of duration and expansion, which comprehend in them all finite beings, and in their full extent belong only to the deity. And therefore we are not to wonder that we comprehend them not, and do so often find our thoughts at a loss, when we would consider them either abstractly in themselves, or as any way attributed to the first incomprehensible being. But when applied to any particular finite beings, the extension of any body is so much of that infinite space as the bulk of that body takes up, and places the position of any body when considered at a certain distance from some other, as the idea of the particular duration of anything is an idea of that position of infinite duration which passes during the existence of that thing. So the time when the thing existed is the idea of that space of duration which passed between some known and fixed period of duration and the being of that thing. One shows the distance of the extremities of the bulk or existence of the same thing, as that it is a foot square or lasted 2 years. The other shows the distance of it in place or existence from other fixed points of space or duration, as that it was in the middle of Lincoln's Inn Fields, or the first degree of Taurus, and in the year of our Lord 1671, or the 1000th year of the Julian period, all which distances we measure by preconceived ideas of certain lengths of space and duration, as inches, feet, miles, and degrees, and in the other, minutes, days, and years, etc. There is one thing more wherein space and duration have a great conformity, and that is, though they are justly reckoned among our simple ideas, yet none of the distinct ideas we have of either is without all manner of composition. Asterisk. What's the asterisk about? Oh no, is it the bishop? I don't think it's the bishop. I think it's just, we're going to talk about Mr. Locke. It has been objected to Mr. Locke that if space consists of parts, as 'tis confessed in this place, he should not have reckoned it in the number of simple ideas, because it seems to be inconsistent with what he says elsewhere, that a simple idea is uncompounded and contains in it nothing but one uniform appearance or conception of the mind, and is not distinguishable into different ideas, page 63. 'Tis farther objected that Mr. Locke hath not given in the 11th chapter of the 2nd book, where he begins to speak of simple ideas, an exact definition of what he understands by the word simple ideas. To these difficulties Mr. Locke answers thus. To begin with the last, he declares that he has not treated the subject in an order perfectly scholastic, having not had much familiarity with those sort of books during the writing of his, and not remembering at all the method in which they are written, and therefore his readers ought not to expect definitions regularly placed at the beginning of each new subject. Mr. Locke contents himself to employ the principal terms that he uses, for that from his use of them the reader may easily comprehend what he means by them. But with respect to the term simple idea, he has had the good luck to define that in the place cited in the objection, and therefore there is no reason to supply that defect. The question then is to know whether the idea of extension agrees with this definition, which will effectually agree to it if it be understood in the sense which Mr. Locke had principally in his view, for that composition which he designed to exclude in that definition was a composition of different ideas in the mind, and not a composition of the same kind in a thing whose essence consists in having parts of the same kind, where you can never come to a part entirely exempted from this composition. So that if the idea of extension consists in having parts, partes extra partes, as the schools speak, 'tis always in the sense of Mr. Locke a simple idea, because the idea of having partes extra partes cannot be resolved into two other ideas. For the remainder of the objection made to Mr. Locke with respect to the nature of extension, Mr. Locke was aware of it, as may be seen in paragraph 9, chapter 15 of the 2nd book, where he says the least portion of space or extension whereof we have a clear and distinct idea may perhaps be the fittest to be considered by us as a simple idea of that kind, out of which our complex modes of space and extension are made up. So that according to Mr. Locke, it may very fitly be called a simple idea, since it is the least idea of space that the mind can form to itself, and that cannot be divided by the mind into any less, whereof it has in itself any determined perception. From whence it follows that it is to the mind one simple idea, and that is sufficient to take away this objection. For 'tis not the design of Mr. Locke in this place to discourse of anything but concerning the ideas of the mind. But if this is not sufficient to clear the difficulty, Mr. Locke hath nothing more to add, but that if the idea of extension is so peculiar that it cannot exactly agree with the definition that he has given of those simple ideas, so that it differs in some manner or other, wanting a proper name, I know not whether I may be allowed to call a sensible point, meaning thereby the least particle. Oh my goodness. I skipped from the asterisk. I thought it was some manner or other, but the asterisk continue. Yeah, I hate. I'm almost swearing at this point. Manner from all others of that kind, he thinks 'tis better leave it there exposed to this difficulty than to make a new division in his favor. 'Tis enough for Mr. Locke that his meaning can be understood. 'Tis very common to observe intelligible discourses spoiled by too much subtlety in nice divisions. We ought to put things together as well as we can, doctrinae causa, but after all, several things will not be bundled up together under our terms and ways of speaking. So I'm guessing that's the end of that beautiful little asterisk there, where Mr. Locke talks about himself in the third person. Thank you so much, Mr. Locke. You're a beautiful human being. So that was the manner of composition. It is the very nature of both of them to consist of parts, but their parts being all of the same kind and without the mixture of any other idea, hinder them not from having a place amongst simple ideas. Could the mind, as in number, come to so final a part of extension or duration as excluded divisibility, that would be, as it were, the indivisible unit or idea, by repetition of which it would make its more enlarged ideas of extension and duration. But since the mind is not able to frame an idea of any space without parts, instead thereof it makes use of the common measures which by familiar use in each country have imprinted themselves on the memory as inches and feet or cubits and parasangs. I have no clue what a parasang is. And so seconds, minutes, hours, days, and years in duration, smiley face. The mind makes use, I say, of such ideas as these as simple ones, and these are the component parts of larger ideas which the mind upon occasion makes by the addition of such known lengths, which it is acquainted with. Scroll down. On the other side, the ordinary smallest measure we have of either is looked on as a unit in number, when the mind by division would reduce them into less fractions, though on both sides, both in addition and division, either of space or duration, when the idea under consideration becomes very big or very small, its precise bulk becomes very obscure and confused, and it is the number of its repeated additions or divisions that alone remains clear and distinct, as will easily appear to anyone who will let his thoughts loose in the vast expansion of space or divisibility of matter. Every part of duration is duration too, and every part of extension is extension, both of them capable of addition or division in infinitum. But the least portions of either of them, whereof we have clear and distinct ideas, may perhaps be fittest to be considered by us as the simple ideas of that kind, out of which our complex modes of space, extension, and duration are made up, and into which they can again be distinctly resolved. Such a small part of duration may be called a moment, and is the time of one idea in our minds in the train of their ordinary succession there. The other, wanting a proper name, I know not whether I may be allowed to call a sensible point, meaning thereby the least particle of matter or space we can discern, which is ordinarily about a minute, and to the sharpest eyes seldom less than 30 seconds of a circle, whereof the eye is the center. Expansion and duration have this farther agreement, that though they are both considered by us having parts, yet their parts are not separable one from another, no, not even in thought. Though the parts of bodies from whence we take our measure of the one, and the parts of motion, or rather the succession of ideas in our minds, from whence we take the measure of the other, may be interrupted and separated, as the one is often by rest, and the other is by sleep, which we call rest too. But yet there is this manifest difference between them, that the ideas of length, which we have of expansion, are turned every way, and so make figure and breadth and thickness. But duration is but, as it were, the length of one straight line extended in infinitum, not capable of multiplicity or variation or figure, but is one common measure of all existence whatsoever, wherein all things whilst they exist equally partake. For this present moment is common to all things that are now in being, and equally comprehends that part of their existence, as much as if they were all but one single being. And we may truly say they all exist in the same moment of time. Whether angels and spirits have any analogy to this in respect of expansion is beyond my comprehension. And perhaps for us, who have understandings and comprehension suited to our own preservation and the ends of our own being, but not to the reality and extent of all other beings, 'tis near as hard to conceive any existence or to have an idea of any real being, with a perfect negation of all manner of expansion, as it is to have the idea of any real existence with a perfect negation of all manner of duration. And therefore what spirits have to do with space, or how they communicate in it, we know not. All that we know is that bodies do each singly possess its proper portion of it according to the extent of its solid parts, and thereby exclude all other bodies from having any share in that particular portion of space whilst it remains there. Duration and time, which is a part of it, is the idea we have of perishing distance, of which no two parts exist together, but follow each other in succession, as expansion is the idea of lasting distance, all whose parts exist together and are not capable of succession. And therefore, though we cannot conceive any duration without succession, nor can put it together in our thoughts that any being does now exist tomorrow, or possess it once more than the present of moment duration, yet we can conceive the eternal duration of the Almighty, far different from that of man or any other finite being, because man comprehends not in his knowledge or power all past and future things. His thoughts are but of yesterday, and he knows not what tomorrow will bring forth. What is once past he can never recall, and what is yet to come he cannot make present. What I say of man, I say of all finite being, who, though they may far exceed man in knowledge and power, yet are no more than the meanest creature in comparison with God himself. Finite of any magnitude, holds not any proportion to infinite. God's infinite duration being accompanied with infinite knowledge and infinite power, he sees all things past and to come, and they are no more distant from his knowledge, no farther removed from his sight than the present. They all lie under the same view, and there is nothing which he cannot make exist each moment that he pleases. For the existence of all things depending upon his good pleasure, all things exist every moment, that he thinks fit to have them exist. To conclude, expansion and duration do mutually embrace and comprehend each other, every part of space being in every part of duration, and every part of duration in every part of expansion. Such a combination of two distinct ideas is, I suppose, scarce to be found in all that great variety we do or can conceive, and may afford matter to farther speculation. Chapter 16 of Number. Amongst all the ideas we have as there is none suggested to the mind by more ways, for there is none more simple than that of unity or one. It has no shadow of variety or composition in it. Every object our senses are employed about, every idea in our understandings, every thought of our minds brings this idea along with it, and therefore it is the most intimate to our thoughts, as well as it is in its agreement to all other things, the most universal idea we have. For number applies itself to men, angels, actions, thoughts, everything that either doth exist or can be imagined. By repeating this idea in our minds and adding the repetitions together, we come by the complex ideas of the modes of it. Thus, by adding 1 to 1, we have the complex idea of a couple. By putting 12 units together, we have the complex idea of a dozen and a score or a million or any other number. The simple modes of number are of all other the most distinct. The least variation, which is a unit, making each combination as clearly different from that which approacheth nearest to it as the most remote. 2 being as distinct from 1 as 200, and the idea of 2 is distinct from the idea of 3 as the magnitude of the whole earth from that of a mite. This is not so in other simple modes, in which it is not so easy nor perhaps possible for us to distinguish betwixt 2 approaching ideas, which yet are really different. For who will undertake to find a difference between the white of this paper and that of the next degree to it, or can form distinct ideas of every the least excess in extension? The clearness and distinctness of each mode of number from all others, even those that approach nearest, makes me apt to think that demonstrations in number, if they are not more evident and exact than this extension, yet they are more general in their use and more determinate in their application, because the ideas of numbers are more precise and distinguishable than in extension, where every equality and excess are not so easy to be observed or measured, because our thoughts cannot in space arrive at any determined smallness beyond which it cannot go as a unit, and therefore the quantity or proportion of any the least excess cannot be discovered, which is clear otherwise in number. Whereas has been said, 91 is as distinguishable from 90 as from 9,000, though 91 be the next immediate excess to 90. But it is not so in extension, where whatsoever is more than just a foot or an inch is not distinguishable from the standard of a foot or an inch. And in lines which appear of an equal length, one may be longer than the other by innumerable parts, nor can anyone assign an angle which shall be the next biggest to a right one. So he's kind of getting into calculus here. By the repeating, as has been said, of the idea of a unit and joining it to another unit, we make thereof one collective idea, marked by the name 2. And whosoever can do this and proceed on, still adding one more to the last collective idea, which he had of any number, and give a name to it, may count or have ideas for several collections of units distinguished one from another, as far as he hath a series of names for following numbers, and a memory to retain that series with their several names, all numeration being but still the adding of one unit more, and giving to the whole together as comprehended in one idea a new or distinct name or sign, whereby to know it from those before and after, and distinguish it from every smaller and greater multitude of units, so that he that can add 1 to 1, and so to 2, and so go on with his tale, taking still with him the distinct names belonging to every progression, and so again by subtracting a unit from each collection, retreat and lessen them, is capable of all the ideas of numbers within the compass of his language, or for which he hath names, though not perhaps of more. For the several simple modes of numbers being in our minds so many combinations of units, which have no variety, nor are capable of any other difference, but more or less names or marks for each distinct combination, seem more necessary than in any sort of ideas. For without such names or marks, we can hardly well make use of numbers in reckoning, especially where the combination is made up of any great multitude of units, which put together without a name or mark to distinguish that precise collection will hardly be kept from being a heap in confusion. This I think to be to This I think to be the reason why some Americans I have spoken with, who were otherwise of quick and rational parts enough, could not, as we do, by any means count to 1,000, nor had any distinct idea of that number, though they could reckon very well to 20, because their language being scanty and accommodated only to the few necessaries of a needy, simple life, unacquainted either with trade or mathematics, had no words in it to stand for 1,000. So that when they were discoursed with of those greater numbers, they would show the hairs of their head to express a great multitude, which they could not number, which inability, I suppose, proceeded from their want of names. The Tauaupenambos had no names for numbers above 5. Any number beyond that they made out by showing their fingers and the fingers of others who were present. And I doubt not but we ourselves might distinctly number in words a great deal farther than we usually do, would we find out but some fit denominations to signify them by, whereas in the way we take now to name them by millions of millions of millions, etc., it is hard to go beyond 18, or at most 4 and 20 decimal progressions without confusion. But to show how many distinct names conduce to our well-reckoning, or having useful ideas of numbers, let us set all these following figures as the marks of one number, v.g. No millions, octillions, septillions, sextillions, quintillions, quadrillions, trillions, billions, millions, units. I have no clue what any of that really means. I mean, I know no, oct, sept, sex, quint, quat, tri, bi. I know those are all roots for 9 through 1. But I don't know what the random numbers below the words mean. The ordinary way of naming this number in English will be the often repeating of millions 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 of millions. Oh, okay. So maybe he's saying here, this is a big number, and he's saying that there are this many in the millions place, this many in the billions place, and so on and so forth, over to the no millions. Okay, maybe I understand what he's saying now. Which is the denomination of the second 6 figures, in which way it would be very hard to have any distinguishing notions of this number, but whether by giving every 6 figures a new and orderly denomination, these and perhaps a great many more figures in progression might not easily be counted distinctly, and ideas of them both got more easily to ourselves and more plainly signified to others, I leave it to be considered. This I mention only to show how necessary distinct names are to numbering, without pretending to introduce new ones of my invention. Thus, children, either for want of names to mark the several progressions of numbers, or not having yet the faculty to collect scattered ideas into complex ones, and range them in a regular order, and so retain them in their memories, as is necessary to reckoning, do not begin to number very early, nor proceed in it very far or steadily, till a good while after they are well furnished with good store of other ideas, and one may often observe them discourse and reason pretty well, and have very clear conceptions of several other things before they can tell 20. And some, through the default of their memories, who cannot retain the several combinations of numbers, with their names annexed in their distinct orders, and the dependence of so long a train of numeral progressions, and their relation one to another, are not able all their lifetime to reckon or regularly go over any moderate series of numbers. For he that will count 20, or have any idea of that number, must know that 19 went before with the distinct name or sign of every one of them, as they stand marked in their order. For wherever this fails, a gap is made, the chain breaks, and the progress in numbering can go no farther. So that to reckon right, it is required, 1, that the mind distinguish carefully 2 ideas, which are different one from another only by the addition or subtraction of 1 unit. 2, that it retain in memory the names or marks of the several combinations from a unit to that number, and that not confusedly and at random, but in that exact order that the numbers follow one another, in either of which, if it trips, the whole business of numbering will be disturbed, and there will remain only the confused idea of multitude, but the ideas necessary to distinct numeration will not be attained to. This farther is observable in number, that it is that which the mind makes use of in measuring all things that by us are measurable, which principally are expansion and duration, and our idea of infinity, even when applied to those, seems to be nothing but the infinity of number. For what else are our ideas of eternity and immensity but the repeated additions of certain ideas of imagined parts of duration and expansion with the infinity of number, in which we can come to no end of addition? For such an inexhaustible stock number of all other of our ideas most clearly furnishes us with, as is obvious to everyone. For let a man collect into one sum as great a number as he pleases, this multitude, how great soever, lessens not one jot the power of adding to it, or brings him any nearer the end of the inexhaustible stock of number, where still there remains as much to be added as if none were taken out. And this endless addition or addability, if anyone like the word better, of numbers so apparent to the mind, is that I think which gives us the clearest and most distinct idea of infinity, of which more in the following chapter. Chapter 17 of Infinity. He that would know what kind of idea it is to which we give the name of infinity cannot do it better than by considering to what infinity is by the mind more immediately attributed and then how the mind comes to frame it. Finite and infinite seem to me to be looked upon by the mind as the modes of quantity, and to be attributed primarily in their first designation only to those things which have parts, and are capable of increase or diminution, and by the addition or subtraction of any the least part. And such are the ideas of space, duration, and number, which we have considered in the foregoing chapters. 'Tis true that we cannot be assured that the great God, of whom and from whom are all things, is incomprehensibly infinite. But yet, when we apply to that first and supreme being our idea of infinite in our weak and narrow thoughts, we do it primarily in respect of his duration and ubiquity, and I think more figuratively to his power, wisdom, and goodness, and other attributes which are properly inexhaustible and incomprehensible, etc. For when we call them infinite, we have no other idea of this infinity but what carries with it some reflection on and intimation of that number or extent of the acts or objects of God's power, wisdom, and goodness, which can never be supposed so great or so many, which these attributes will not always surmount and exceed. Let us multiply them in our thoughts as far as we can with all the infinity of endless number. I do not pretend to say how these attributes are in God, who is infinitely beyond the reach of our narrow capacities. They do without doubt contain in them all possible perfection, but this, I say, is our way of conceiving them, and these are ideas of their infinity. Finite, then, and infinite being by the mind looked on as modifications of expansion and duration, the next thing to be considered is how the mind comes by them. As for the idea of finite, there is no great difficulty. The obvious portions of extension that affect our senses carry with them into the mind the idea of finite, and the ordinary periods of succession, whereby we measure time and duration as hours, days, and years, are bounded lengths. The difficulty is how we come by those boundless ideas of eternity and immensity, since the objects which we converse with come so much short of any approach or proportion to that largeness. Everyone that has any idea of any stated lengths of space as a foot finds that he can repeat that idea, and joining it to the former make the idea of 2 foot, and by the addition of a third 3 foot, and so on, without ever coming to the end of his additions, whether of the same idea of a foot, or if he pleases, of doubling it, or any other idea he has of any length as a mile or a diameter of the earth, or of the orbis magnus. for whichsoever of these he takes, and how often soever he doubles, or any otherwise multiplies it, he finds that after he has continued this doubling in his thoughts and enlarged his idea as much as he pleases, he has no more reason to stop, nor is one jot nearer the end of such addition than he was at first setting out. The power of enlarging his idea of space by farther additions remaining still the same, he hence takes the idea of infinite space. This, I think, is the way whereby the mind gets the idea of infinite space. Faustian. 'Tis a quite different consideration to examine whether the mind has the idea of such a boundless space actually existing, since our ideas are not always proofs of the existence of things. But yet, since this comes here in our way, I suppose I may say that we are apt to think that space in itself is actually boundless, to which imagination the idea of space and expansion of itself naturally leads us. For it being considered by us either as the extension of body or as existing by itself without any solid matter taking it up, for of such a void space we have not only the idea, but I have proved, as I think from the motion of bodies, its necessary existence. It is impossible the mind should be ever able to find or suppose any end of it, or be stopped anywhere in its progress in this space, how far soever it extends its thoughts. Any bounds made with body, even adamantine walls, are so far from putting a stop to the mind in its farther progress in space and extension that it rather facilitates and enlarges it. For so far as that body reaches, so far no one can doubt of extension, and when we are come to the utmost extremity of body, what is there that can there put a stop and satisfy the mind that it is at the end of space, when it perceives it is not? Nay, when it is satisfied that body itself can move into it. For if it be necessary for the motion of body that there should be an empty space, though never so little, here amongst bodies, and it be possible for body to move in or through that empty space, nay, it is impossible for any particle of matter to move but into an empty space, the same possibility of a body's moving into a void space, beyond the utmost bounds of body, as well as into a void space interspersed amongst bodies, will always remain clear and evident. The idea of empty pure space, whether within or beyond the confines of all bodies, being exactly the same, differing not in nature, though in bulk, and there being nothing to hinder body from moving into it, so that wherever the mind places itself by any thought, either amongst or remote from all bodies, it can in this uniform idea of space nowhere find any bounds, any ends, and so must necessarily conclude it by the very nature and idea of each part of it to be actually infinite. As by the power we find in ourselves of repeating as often as we will any idea of space, we get the idea of immensity. So, by being able to repeat the idea of any length of duration we have in our minds with all the endless addition of number, we come by the idea of eternity. For we find in ourselves we can no more come to an end of such repeated ideas than we can come to the end of number, which everyone perceives he cannot. But here again, 'tis another question quite different from our having an idea of eternity, to know whether there were any real being whose duration has been eternal. And as to this I say, he that considers something now existing must necessarily come to something eternal. But having spoken of this in another place, I shall say here no more of it, but proceed on to some other considerations of our idea of infinity. If it be so that our idea of infinity be got from the power we observe in ourselves of repeating without end our own ideas, it may be demanded why we do not attribute infinity to other ideas as well as those of space and duration, since they may be as easily and as often repeated in our minds as the other. And yet nobody ever thinks of infinite sweetness or infinite whiteness, though he can repeat the idea of sweet or white as frequently as those of a yard or a day. To which I answer, all the ideas that are considered as having parts and are capable of increase by the addition of any equal or less parts affords us by their reputation the idea of infinity, because with this endless repetition there is continued an enlargement of which there can be no end. But in other ideas it is not so, for to the largest idea of extension or duration that I at present have, the addition of the least part makes an increase. But to the perfectest idea I have of the whitest whiteness, if I add another of a less or equal whiteness, and of a whiter than I have, I cannot add the idea, it makes no increase and enlarges not my idea at all, and therefore the different ideas of whiteness, etc., are called degrees. So he's sort of distinguishing here between ideas which are qualitative in nature, which can be infinite, and ideas which are qualitative in nature, which are of a percentile nature. So we're talking about digital concepts that can be separated into digits, which are infinite, and analog concepts like a clock, which go by degrees or angles or percents, such as whiteness. We can't have infinite whiteness. We either have 100% or 0% or somewhere in between. For those ideas that consist of parts are capable of being augmented by every addition of the least part. But if you will take the idea of white, which one parcel of snow yielded yesterday to your sight, and another idea of white to another parcel of snow you see today, and put them together in your mind, they embody, as it were, and run into one, and the idea of whiteness is not at all increased, and if we add a less degree of whiteness to a greater, we are so far from increasing that we diminish it. Those ideas that consist not of parts cannot be augmented to what proportion men please, or be stretched beyond what they have received by their senses. But space, duration, and number, being capable of increase by repetition, leave in the mind an idea of an endless room for more. Nor can we conceive anywhere a stop to a farther addition and progression, and for those ideas alone lead our mind toward the thought of infinity. Though our idea of infinity arise from the contemplation of quantity, and the endless increase of the mind is able to make in quantity, by the repeated additions of what portions thereof it pleases, yet I guess we cause great confusion in our thoughts when we join infinity to any supposed idea of quantity the mind can be thought to have, and so discourse or reason about an infinite quantity vis-a-vis an infinite space or an infinite duration. For idea of infinity being, as I think, an endless growing idea, but the idea of any quantity the mind has, being at that time terminated in that idea, for be it as great as it will, it can be no greater than it is. To join infinity to it is to adjust a standing measure to a growing bulk. And therefore, I think it is not an insignificant subtlety if I say that we are carefully to distinguish between the idea of the infinity of space and the idea of a space infinite. The first is nothing but a supposed endless progression of the mind over what repeated ideas of space it pleases, but to have actually in the mind the idea of a space infinite is to suppose the mind already passed over, and actually to have a view of all those repeated ideas of space which an endless repetition can never totally represent to it, which carries in it a plain contradiction. This perhaps will be a little plainer if we can consider it in numbers. The infinity of numbers, to the end of whose addition everyone perceives there is no approach, easily appears to anyone that reflects on it. But how clear soever this idea of the infinity of number be, there is nothing yet more evident than the absurdity of the actual idea of an infinite number. Whatsoever positive ideas we have in our minds of any space, duration, or number, let them be ever so great, they are still finite. But when we suppose an inexhaustible remainder, from which we remove all bounds, and wherein we allow the mind an endless progression of thoughts without ever completing the idea, there we have our idea of infinity, which, though it seems to be pretty clear when we consider nothing else in it but the negation of an end, yet when we would frame in our minds the idea of an infinite space or duration, that idea is very obscure and confused, because it is made up of two parts, very different, if not inconsistent. For let a man frame in his mind an idea of any space or number, as great as he will, 'tis plain the mind rests and terminates in that idea, which is contrary to the idea of infinity, which consists in a supposed endless progression. And therefore, I think it is that we are so easily confounded when we come to argue and reason about infinite space or duration, etc., because the parts of such an idea, not being perceived to be as they are inconsistent, the one side or other always perplexes, whatever consequences we draw from the other, as an idea of motion not passing on would perplex anyone who should argue from such an idea, which is not better than an idea of motion or rest, and such another seems to me to be the idea of a space, or, which is the same thing, a number infinite, i.e. of a space or number which the mind actually has, and so views and terminates in, and of a space or number which in a constant and endless enlarging and progression it can in thought never attain to. For how large soever an idea of space I have in my mind, it is no larger than it is that instant that I have it, though I be capable the next instant to double it, and so on in infinitum. For that alone is infinite, which has no bounds, and that the idea of infinity in which our thoughts can find none. But of all other ideas, it is number, as I have said, which I think furnishes us with the clearest and most distinct idea of infinity we are capable of. For even in space and duration, when the mind pursues the idea of infinity, it there makes use of the ideas and repetitions of numbers, as of millions of miles or years, which are so many distinct ideas, kept best by number from running into a confused heap, wherein the mind loses itself. And when it has added together as many millions, etc., as it pleases, of known lengths or space or duration, the clearest idea it can get of infinity is the confused, incomprehensible remainder of endless addable numbers, which affords no prospect of stop or boundary. It will perhaps give us a little farther light into the idea we have of infinity, and discover to us that it is nothing but the infinity of number applied to determinate parts, of which we have in our minds the distinct ideas, if we consider that number is not generally thought by us infinite, whereas duration and extension are apt to be so, which arises from hence that in number we are at one end as it were. For there being in number nothing less than a unit, we there stop and are at an end, but in addition or increase of number, we can set no bounds. And so it is like a line whereof one end terminating with us, the other is extended still forwards beyond all that we can conceive. But in space and duration it is otherwise. For in duration we consider it as if this line of number were extended both ways to an unconceivable, undeterminate, and infinite length, which is evident to anyone that will but reflect on what consideration he hath of eternity, which I suppose he will find to be nothing else but the turning this infinity of number both ways, a parte ante and a parte post, as they speak. For when we would consider eternity a parte ante, what do we but, beginning from ourselves, and the present time we are in, repeat in our minds the ideas of years or ages or any other assignable portion of duration past, with the prospect of proceeding in such addition with all the infinity of number. And when we would consider eternity a parte post, we just after the same rate begin from ourselves and reckon by multiplied periods yet to come, still extending that line of numbers as before, and these two being put together are that infinite duration we call eternity, which as we turn our view either way, forwards or backwards, appears infinite, because we still turn that way, that infinite end of number, i.e. the power still of adding more. The same happens also in space, wherein conceiving ourselves to be as it were in the center, we do on all sides pursue those indeterminable lines of number, and reckoning any way from ourselves, a yard, mile, diameter of the earth, or orbis magnus, by the infinity of number, we add others to them as often as we will, and having no more reason to set bounds to those repeated ideas than we have to set bounds to number, we have that indeterminable idea of immeasurability, or immensity is the word there, the idea of immensity. And since in any bulk of matter our thoughts can never arrive at the utmost divisibility, therefore there is an apparent infinity to us also in that which has the infinity also of number, but with this difference that in the former considerations of the infinity of space or duration, we only use addition of numbers, whereas this is like the division of a unit into its fractions, wherein the mind also can proceed in infinitum, as well as in the former additions, it being indeed but the addition still of new numbers. Though in the addition of the one, we can have no more the positive idea of a space infinitely great than in the division of the other, we can have the idea of a body infinitely little, or idea of infinity being, as I may so say, a growing and fugitive, or is that suggestive? I think that's a fugitive idea. A growing and fugitive idea, still in a boundless progression that can stop nowhere. Though it be hard, I think, to find anyone so absurd as to say he has the positive idea of an actual infinite number, the infinity whereof lies only in a power still of adding any combination of units to any former number, and that as long and as much as one will, the like also being in the infinity of space and duration, which power leaves always to the mind room for endless additions, yet there be those who imagine they have positive ideas of infinite duration and space. It would, I think, be enough to destroy any such positive idea of infinite, to ask him that has it, whether he could add to it or no, which would easily show the mistake of such a positive idea. We can, I think, have no positive idea of any space or duration which is not made up of and can measure it to repeated numbers of feet or yards or days and years, which are the common measures whereof we have the ideas in our minds, and whereby we judge of the greatness of these sort of qualities or quantities. And therefore, since an idea of infinite space or duration must needs be made up of infinite parts, it can have no other infinity than that of number, capable still of farther addition, but not an actual positive idea of a number infinite. For I think it is evident that the addition of finite things together, as are all lengths whereof we have the positive ideas, can never otherwise produce the idea of infinite than as number does, which, consisting of additions of finite units one to another, suggests the idea of infinite only by a power we find we have of still increasing the sum and adding more of the same kind, without coming one jot nearer the end of such progression. They who would prove their idea of infinite to be positive seem to me to do it by a pleasant argument taken from the negation of an end, which, being negative, the negation of it is positive. He that considers that the end is not in body, but the extremity or superficies of that body, will not perhaps be forward to grant that the end is a bare negative. And he that perceives the end of his pen is black or white, will be apt to think that the end is something more than a pure negation. Nor is it, when applied to duration, the bare negation of existence, but more properly the last moment of it. But if they will have the end to be nothing but the bare negation of existence, I am sure they cannot deny, but that the beginning is the first instance of being, and is not by anybody conceived to be a bare negation. And therefore, by their own argument, the idea of eternal a parte ante, or of a duration without beginning, is but a negative idea. The idea of infinite has, I confess, something of positive in all those things we apply to it. When we would think of infinite space or duration, we at first step usually make some very large idea, as perhaps of millions of ages or miles, which possibly we double and multiply several times. All that we thus amass together in our thoughts is positive, and the assemblage of a great number of positive ideas of space or duration. But what still remains beyond this, we have no more a positive distinct notion of than a mariner has of the depth of the sea, where having let down a large portion of his sounding line, he reaches no bottom, whereby he knows the depth to be so many fathoms and more, but how much that more is, he hath no distinct notion at all. And could he always supply new line and find the plummet always sink without ever stopping, he would be something in the posture of the mind reaching after a complete and positive idea of infinity. In which case, let this line be 10 or 10,000 fathoms long, it equally discovers what is beyond it, and gives only this confused and comparative idea that this is not all, but one may yet go farther. So much as the mind comprehends of any space it has a positive idea of, but in endeavoring to make it infinite, it being always enlarging, always advancing, the idea is still imperfect and incomplete. So much space as the mind takes a view of in its completion, in its contemplation of greatness, is a clear picture and positive in the understanding, but infinite is still greater. Then the idea of so much is positive and clear. The idea of greater is also clear, but it is but a comparative idea. The idea of so much greater as cannot be comprehended, and this is plain negative, not positive. For he has no positive clear idea of the largeness of any extension, which is that sought for in the idea of infinite, that has not a comprehensive idea of the dimensions of it, and such nobody, I think, pretends to in what is infinite. For to say a man has a positive clear idea of any quantity without knowing how great it is, as is reasonable as to say he has the positive clear idea of the number of the sands on the seashore, who knows not how many they be, but only that they are more than 20. For just such a perfect and positive idea he has of an infinite space or duration, who says it is larger than the extent or duration of 10, 100, 1,000, or any other number of miles or years whereof he has or can have a positive idea, which is all the idea I think we shall have of infinite. So that what lies beyond our positive idea toward infinity lies in obscurity, and has the indeterminate confusion of a negative idea, wherein I know I neither do nor can comprehend all I would, it being too large for a finite and narrow capacity, and that cannot but be very far from a positive complete idea, wherein the greatest part of what I would comprehend is left out under the what does this mean? Undeterminate intimation of being still greater. For to say that having in any quantity, measured so much or gone so far, you are not yet at the end, is only to say that the quantity is greater. So that the negation of an end in any quantity is, in other words, only to say that it is bigger, and a total negation of an end is but the carrying this bigger still with you, in all the progressions your thoughts shall make in quantity, and adding this idea of still greater to all the ideas you have, or can be supposed to have of quantity. Now, whether such an idea as that be positive, I leave anyone to consider. And with that, we're going to change the lighting to prevent eye strain. Give me a second. I'm gonna meander over here, and that's on. I'm gonna meander back into the camera view, and we'll rejoin, and maybe grab a bit of water here. Have a slight drink. What does Locke mean when he says infinity is a negative idea? Does infinity exist or not? We use it in calculus. I don't think Locke, did he have calculus? Newton came up with calculus, right? So does he believe in infinity? What's going on? I ask those who say they have a positive idea of eternity whether their idea of duration includes in it succession or not. If it does not, they ought to show the difference of their notion of duration when applied to an eternal being and to an infinite, since perhaps there may be others, as well as I, who will own to them their weakness of understanding in this point. We have a message retracted, which is disturbing me. Admiral Murat is retracting messages, unfortunately. If you have something you're going to retract, don't say anything at all. All right, to continue with this, the notion they have of duration forces them to conceive that whatever has duration is of a longer continuance today than it was yesterday. If to avoid succession in eternal existence, they recur to the punctum stans of the schools, I suppose they will thereby very little mend the matter or help us to a more clear and positive idea of infinite duration, there being nothing more inconceivable to me than duration without succession. Besides that punctum stans, if it signify anything, being not quantum, finite or infinite, cannot belong to it. But if our weak apprehensions cannot separate succession from any duration whatsoever, our idea of eternity can be nothing but of infinite succession of moments or duration wherein anything does exist. And whether anyone has or can have a positive idea of an actual infinite number, I leave him to consider till his infinite number be so great that he himself can add no more to it, and as long as he can increase it, I doubt he himself will think the idea he hath of it a little too scant for positive infinity. I think it unavoidable for every considering rational creature that will but examine his own or any other existence to have the notion of an eternal wise being, who had no beginning, and such an idea of infinite duration I am sure I have. But this negation of a being but the negation of a positive thing, scarce gives me a positive idea of infinity, which whenever I endeavor to extend my thoughts to, I confess myself at a loss. I find I cannot attain any clear comprehension of it. So he's saying maybe infinity does exist, but it exists as something negative, as the breaking of limits. So this is possibly Pythagorean. A Pythagorean analysis of the concept of infinity is something negative and boundless as opposed to the one which is positive. Let's see what our viewer, we got 13 viewers, 13 likes. I need 14 likes to keep it going. He that thinks he has a positive idea of infinite space will, when he considers it, find that he can no more have a positive idea of the greatest than he has of the least space, for in this latter, which seems the easier of the two, and more within our comprehension, we are capable only of a comparative idea of smallness, which will always be less than any one whereof we have the positive idea. All our positive ideas of any quantity, whether great or little, have always bounds, though our comparative idea, whereby we can always add to the one and take from the other, hath no bounds, for that which remains either great or little, not being comprehended, in that positive idea which we have, lies in obscurity, and we have no other idea of it but of the power of enlarging the one and diminishing the other without ceasing. A pestle and mortar will as soon bring any particle of matter to indivisibility as the acutest thought of a mathematician, and a surveyor may as soon with his chain measure out infinite space as a philosopher by the quickest sleight of mind reach it, or by thinking comprehend it, which is to have a positive idea of it. He that thinks on a cube of an inch diameter has a clear and positive idea of it in his mind, and so can something one of 1/2 and 1/4, 1/8, and so on till he has the idea in his thought of something very little, but yet reaches not the idea of that incomprehensible littleness which division can produce. What remains of smallness is as far from his thoughts as when he first began, and therefore he never comes at all to have a clear and positive idea of that smallness which is consequent to infinite divisibility. Look, they printed the letter A upside down here in this word. That's amazing. How does that even happen? How do you even print the letter A upside down? Because obviously they weren't writing that. Obviously he wasn't like writing the letter A. This is a printing. How do you do that? How do you print that upside down? Thank you for the like, Napoleonov. I appreciate. We just jumped up to 18 likes and 12 viewers, so that's very impressive. We're liking those ratios there. That's beautiful. I love everybody. Okay, so we're talking about infinite divisibility. Everyone that looks toward infinity does, as I have said at first glance, make some very large idea of that which he applies it to, let it be space or duration, and possibly he wearies his thoughts by multiplying in his mind that first large idea, but yet by that he comes no nearer to the having a positive clear idea of what remains to make up a positive infinity than the country fellow had of the water, which was yet to come and pass the channel of the river where he stood. Okay, we got some Latin here. Rusticus expectat dum transfeat amnis, at ille labitur et labitur in omne volubilis aevum. So rusticus, I believe, has to do with the countryside. Expectat dum transeat amnis. What is amnis? Is it like amnit? I don't know what amnis is. Labitur, maybe having to do with labor. Labitur at labetur in all volub. What is volub? Voluble? Volubus? I don't know what it means, but maybe we'll do at some point, we'll do like a 5-hour Latin stream where we just learn Latin words together. Wouldn't that be fun? Imagine if we could all speak Latin together. That would be fun. Imagine if we were all like 9 years old and we were all like learning Latin together with our infant. Just think back on how smart you were when you were younger. Like, kids are super geniuses. I'm just a big dummy today. But when we were 9 years old, we could learn Latin so easily it would make your head spin. Just imagine that youth, that we could be 9 years old again and learn Latin together. Isn't that a nice thought? There are some I have met with that put so much difference between infinite duration and infinite space that they persuade themselves that they have a positive idea of infinity, but that they have not, nor can have any idea of infinite space. The reason of which mistake I suppose to be this, that finding by a due contemplation of causes and effects that it is necessary to admit some eternal being, and so to consider the real existence of that being as taking up and can measure it to their idea of eternity, but on the other side not finding it necessary, but on the contrary apparently absurd, that body should be infinite, they forwardly conclude they can have no idea of infinite space, because they can have no idea of infinite matter, which consequence I conceive is very ill collected, because the existence of matter is no ways necessary to the existence of space, no more than the existence of motion or the sun is necessary to duration, though duration uses to be measured by it. And I doubt not but a man may have the idea of 10,000 miles square without any body so big, as well as the idea of 10,000 years without any body so old. It seems as easy to me to have the idea of space empty of body as to think of the capacity of a bushel without corn, or the hollow of a nutshell without a kernel in it, it being no more necessary that there should be existing a solid body infinitely extended, because we have an idea of the infinity of space, than it is necessary that the world should be eternal, because we have an idea of infinite duration. And why should we think our idea of infinite space requires the real existence of matter to support it, when we find that we have as clear an idea of infinite duration to come as we have of infinite duration past? Though I suppose nobody thinks it conceivable that anything does or has existed in that future duration. Nor is it possible to join our idea of future duration with present or past existence, any more than it is possible to make the ideas of yesterday, today, and tomorrow to be the same, or bring ages past and future together and make them contemporary. But if these men are of the mind that they have clearer ideas of infinite duration than of infinite space, because it is past doubt that God has existed from all eternity, but there is no real matter coextended with infinite space, yet those philosophers who are of opinion that infinite space is possessed by God's infinite omnipresence, as well as infinite duration by his eternal existence, must be allowed to have as clear an idea of infinite space as of infinite duration, though neither of them, I think, has any positive idea of infinity in either case. For whatsoever positive ideas a man has in his mind of any quantity, he can repeat it and add it to the former, as easy as he can add together the ideas of 2 days or 2 paces, which are positive ideas of lengths he has in his mind, and so on as long as he pleases. Whereby, if a man had a positive idea of infinite, either duration or space, he could add 2 infinites together, nay, make one infinite infinitely bigger than the other, absurdities too gross to be confuted. But yet, if after all this there be men who persuade themselves that they have clear, positive, comprehensive ideas of infinity, it is fit they enjoy their privilege, and I should be very glad with some others that I know, who acknowledge they have none such, to be better informed by their communication, for I have been hitherto apt to think that the great and inextricable difficulties which perpetually involve all discourses concerning infinity, whether of space, duration, or divisibility, have been the certain marks of a defect in our ideas of infinity, and the disproportion the nature thereof has to the comprehension of our narrow capacities. For whilst men talk and dispute of infinite space and duration, as if they had as complete and positive ideas of them as they have of the names they use for them, or they have of a yard, or an hour, or any other determinate quantity, it is no wonder if the incomprehensible nature of the thing they discourse of or reason about leads them into perplexities and contradictions, and their minds be overlaid by an object too large and mighty to be surveyed and managed by them. If I had dwelt pretty long on the considerations of duration, space, and number, and what arises from the contemplation of them, infinity, it is possibly no more than the matter requires, there being few simple ideas whose modes give more exercise to the thoughts of men than these do. I pretend not to treat them in their full latitude. It suffices to my design to show how the mind receives them, such as they are, from sensation and reflection, and how even the idea we have of infinity, how remote soever it may seem to be from any other object of sense or operation of our mind, has nevertheless, as all our other ideas, its original there. Some mathematicians, perhaps, of advanced speculations, may have other ways to introduce into their minds ideas of infinity, but this hinders not, but that they themselves, as well as all other men, got the first ideas which they had of infinity from sensation and reflection in the method we have here set down, chapter 18 of the other simple modes. Okay, well, that's pretty good, right? We got to page 227, which means we only have 200 pages more to go, which means we're over the hill, folks. 9 viewers, 19 likes. I like this. I like this stuff. Okay, let's check it out. Fourth density retracted a message, which makes me sad. Liking and leaving. Thank you, Charles. Liking and stained. Thank you, fourth density. We should read poetry. Well, I'm not going to do it if you keep retracting your messages. Locke simping for God. Locke is turning me into a Christian. Locke is an alternative to pornography. Emerging, or he is a higher form of pornography. Emerging spatio-temporal rational technological consciousness be like dude space. The nod sensitive I've been was during the 2 times there were, the most attentive I've been was during the times there were asterisks. Locke is a joke. Very funny. What is ASMR? Google it, my friend. Simple, really. Gonna go play Halo. Time to sleep. Roger Scruton has died. Quarter, first moon with face. Book, man tone 2. And that looks like tacos or some kind of food object there. Google is not telling me what that object is. No one's ever really gone. No, really, no ever one's gone. Parasang, an ancient Iranian unit of walking distance varying depending on terrain and speed of travel. The equivalent European unit is the League. Herodotus says an army marched 5 parasangs a day. Is this for school? I think it's for Sargon of Akkad, Carl of Swindon. How? No idea who it is, so I guess you can say your joke went over my head. Damn, this is very boring indeed. Well, I'm not I'm not trying to confuse people here. Make sure to smash that like button. Puzzle piece, man, taco, book, stuck out tongue, winking eye. Hello, master. Talib equals Chad. Yeah, Talib. I don't know. There's some people who don't like Talib for specific reasons, or argue against him, or find him to be naive. And maybe you could check out my Twitter timeline to find out why. I find this calming. I'm in a helicopter ride right now. That's cool. Sargon is an English YouTuber who tried to give the impression that he was exposing Richard's ignorance by asking him in a debate, have you even read Locke? It's now a meme. I talked to Richard yesterday, and that was brought up, actually. Oh, wow, that's interesting. Admiral Murat. I didn't know he talked to Christian heretics or whatever, however you describe it. The last time I tried to look into your theology, it was like Messianic Judaism. I didn't know. I guess Richard will just talk to anybody. If he'll talk to Messianic Jews, I guess he'll just talk to anybody. Not an insult. It's just like I think he hates Jesus. So I don't know why he's talking to you if you're a Messianic Jew. It just doesn't make sense. I'm just confused. Yeah, I guess this would have been good to do a year ago, right? Regardless on your position on Richard, Sargon is a well-known liar. Sargon is a something, empty space. Had a strange moment on the bus today. The reflection of my screen was still on for a moment after I turned it off. I was sleepy, to be fair. Very existential. There is no excuse for Sargon. He has undergone practically no ideological development in the last few years, in spite of everyone screaming the truth at him. He's an opportunist. He is one of the most obnoxious and rude individuals I've ever had a conversation with in the political landscape. Vaush was, in fact, more respectful and considerate of your point of view. Ideological abstractions have the convenience of not being subject to reality. Real X has never been tried. This is all Plato's fault. Vaush has actually done argument reflection, as well as created well-organized treatises for arguments Sargon writ. Can we get a comment on Greta Thunberg, Roger Federer beef? What are your thoughts on this issue? Who should we support going forward? Well, it's against the terms of service for me to disagree with a child. Is Greta Thunberg 18 yet? I don't know, but to be on the safe side, she is a woman and she is younger and therefore superior and more protected than Roger Federer. But I will say, aside from that dispute, I will say that I have never had positive feelings toward Greta Thunberg, and I have never had negative feelings toward Roger Federer. But those statements have nothing to do with one another. We have a message retracted from Napoleonov. Alternative hypothesis might be better than Sargon, pretty close, in my opinion, of lackluster contemplation as well as dull arguments. IQ nationalism is probably the most absurd assertion I've seen in my life on the internet. Message retracted. Heard you get a question in on the EBL Nietzsche episode, Murat. That was one of the better YouTube discussions I've heard in a while. Nationalism isn't real. It's a psychological state that finds its expression mostly in virtual reality. It's a cope. IQ is not a sacral entity or an abstraction useful for developing order. Even if it is true, which I find lacking, it would still provide little value. I would like there to be a society and culture that is created and maintained by my extended kin group, which is insular and able to survive into the future. Personally, I can't invest myself in watching people who base their worldview on charts, numbers, and graphs. Yes, Michael, I attempted to Praetorist pill them, but not sure how they took it. What is the deal with his Praetorist pill? Richard messaged me inquiring on the subject. Oh, so he didn't know what you were about. Okay, now I understand what's going on. He was like, what is Praetorism? And then you filled him in, and I'm sure that went well. IQ is a measurement that correlates with a lot of other things, even if it is a limited and imperfect measurement itself. It is simply an eschatological viewpoint concerning biblical matters of the judgment of Christ in the apocalypse. It is the view that the second coming of Christ was in 70 AD during the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. But I know IQ is not wisdom or anything. You can feel Ken's annoyance at this point. He can't wait to finish this. Basically, the judgment of the living and the dead and Gehenna fire are all prophecies about real events that would occur in the generation. As the scripture states, Matthew 24 connects the temple destruction with the end of the old heaven and earth. So, would that imply that earth is now hell or purgatory or something? We've all missed our opportunity at salvation. There is Sheol, which is the grave. Purgatory was the period between the testing between the death of Christ and the second coming, 40 years approximately. So now we are in Sheol, or the earth has become Sheol, retracted because of the spelling error. No, we are just here. We aren't dead in the ground. What I miss? The second coming. Dang. We missed out on the slaughter of 70 AD. Dang it. Here you go, Ken. Now you guys are saying the earth is a big shul. I suppose Ken is the presiding rabbi. Sheol is not shul. Sheol is the realm of the dead. Every KB viewer knows what Sheol is. Message retracted. That's the only acceptable message retracted. 9-year-old me be like big brain Wojak. You guys are very devoted Kenneth fans. We certainly do. Very devoted Locke fans, actually. Children are geniuses, you're right, but people on the internet exaggerate the decline in learning ability as you get older. Steve Kaufman, Linguo Steve, is still learning languages in his 70s. Well, it's different from everybody, but I can tell you personally that when I was 9 years old, I picked up things like a sponge, and if you dropped me in a foreign country, I would just learn the language. It would just be easy. Whereas now that's not the case. But there are some people who retain that genius longer than others. So, pointing to an exceptional anecdote does not disprove what I'm saying. It just makes me jealous. We have Neanderthal brains, so we can recite this whole thing by memory when he's done. I feel like Kenneth is streaming this to ensure he finishes the book. No, you are a very devoted Kenneth fan. Keep your Neanderthal brain to yourself. Today is a Monday work day. Do you think Kenneth is higher education and enjoying his winter break by reading Locke? Those children who most consume media were the most proficient in English in my generation, though it is probably no coincidence they were also on average the smarter ones. How old is Kenneth? 26. Maybe Ken is trying to get over his habit of not reading books by putting social pressure on himself by reading book in his Publix. Looks to be in his 20s. Yeah, that was my point. Kenneth should live stream him reading the KJV Bible. That's probably not going to happen because I've already read it cover to cover. I don't even remember which version I read, but we're over the hill, folks. That's right, Ken. Most of the pages are already read, and it's all downhill from here. Where are the elegant ideas, Kenneth? We need somebody to scratch a fertile patch of his brain. True, but Roger Federer is about to enter to billionaire class, and it might be wise for us to try to court him as a potential patron. Yeah, I stan Roger Federer. I don't know if he's going to be a billionaire. That would surprise me, but if so, then I will follow Roger. He is my leader. He is my sovereign, and he is my sacred center of morality. All other abstractions are moot in comparison with him. Ideology is but a tool that I use to promote the power of my Lord, Roger Federer. So to that effect, I dedicate this reading to Lord Roger Federer, champion, warrior king of the tennis, the battle of tennis, the European contest, the physical challenge. He is the Achilles. He is a true Achilles. And I dedicate this reading to Roger Federer, this chapter 18 of the other simple modes. Let me get a swig of water. Let me imbibe liquid water, which represents the waters of truth and goodness that flow from the spiritual eminence of Roger Federer. That tastes just like him. Delicious. Beautiful. I am now reinvigorated, rehydrated, and I am ready to continue. We are on page 227 if you're following along, and we're feeling great. The modes of motion. Though I have in the foregoing chapters shown how far from simple ideas taken in by sensation the mind comes to extend itself even to infinity, which, however, it may of all others seem most remote from any sensible perception of, yet at last hath nothing in it but what is made out of simple ideas received into the mind by the senses, and afterwards there put together by the faculty of the mind, as to repeat its own ideas, though I say these might be instances enough of simple modes of the simple ideas of sensation, and suffice to show how the mind comes by them, yet I shall for method's sake, though briefly give an account of some few more, and then proceed to more complex ideas. Excuse me. I should have muted the mic there. So that was all one sentence, by the way. To slide, roll, tumble, walk, creep, run, dance, leap, skip, and abundance of others that might be named are words which are no sooner heard, but everyone who understands English has presently in his mind distinct ideas, which are all but the different modifications of motion. Modes of motion answer those of extension. Swift and slow are two different ideas of motion, the measures whereof are made of the distance of time and space put together, so they are complex ideas, comprehending time and space with motion. The like variety have we in sounds. Every articulate word is a different modification of sound, by which we see that from the sense of hearing, by such modifications, the mind may be furnished with distinct ideas to almost an infinite number. Sounds also, besides the distinct cries of birds and beasts, are modified by diversity of notes of different length put together, which make that complex idea called a tune, which a musician may have in his mind when he hears or makes no sound at all, by reflecting on the ideas of those sounds so put together silently in his own fancy. Those of colors are also very various. Some we take notice of as the different degrees, or as they are termed shades of the same color. But since we very seldom make assemblages of colors either for use or delight, but figure is taken in also, and has its part in it, as in painting, weaving, needleworks, etc., those which are taken notice of do most commonly belong to mixed modes, as being made up of ideas of diverse kinds, vis-a-vis figure and color, such as beauty, rainbow, etc. All compounded tastes and smells are also modes made up of these simple ideas of those senses, but they being such as generally we have no names for, are less taken notice of, and cannot be set down in writing, and therefore must be left without enumeration to the thoughts and experience of my reader. In general, it may be observed that those simple modes, which are considered but as different degrees of the same simple idea, though they are in themselves many of them very distinct ideas, yet have ordinarily no distinct names, nor are much taken notice of as distinct ideas, where the difference is but very small between them. Whether men have neglected these modes and given no names to them, as wanting measures nicely to distinguish them, or because when they were so distinguished that knowledge would not be of general or necessary use, I leave it to the thoughts of others. It is sufficient to my purpose to show that all our simple ideas come to our minds only by sensation and reflection, and that when the mind has them, it can variously repeat and compound them, and so make new complex ideas. But though white, red, or sweet, etc., have not been modified or made into complex ideas by several combinations, so as to be named and thereby ranked into species, yet some others of the simple ideas vis-a-vis those of unity, duration, motion, etc., above instance in, as also power and thinking, have been thus modified to a great variety of complex ideas with names belonging to them. The reason whereof, I suppose, has been this, that the great concernment of men being with men one amongst another, the knowledge of men and their actions, and their signifying of them to one another, was most necessary, and therefore they made ideas of actions very nicely modified, and give those complex ideas names, that they might the more easily record and discourse of those things they were daily conversant in, without long ambages and circumlocutions, and that the things they were continually to give and receive information about might be the easier and quicker understood. That this is so, and that men in framing different complex ideas and giving them names have been very much governed by the end of speech in general, which is a very short and expedite way of conveying their thoughts one to another, is evident in the names which in several arts have been found out and applied to several complex ideas of modified actions belonging to their several trades for dispatch's sake, and their direction or discourse about them, which ideas are not generally framed in the minds of men not conversant about these operations, and thence the words that stand for them by the greatest part of men of the same language are not understood, v.g. coalshire, drilling. What is coalshire? Drilling, filtration, cohobation. I have no clue what those things are words standing for certain complex ideas, which means seldom in the minds of any but those few whose particular employments do at every turn suggest them to their thoughts, but those names of them are not generally understood but by smiths and chemists, who having framed the complex ideas which these words stand for, and having given names to them or received them from others, upon hearing of these names in communication, readily conceive those ideas in their minds, as by cohobation all the simple ideas of distilling and the pouring of liquor distilled from anything back upon the remaining matter and distilling it again. Thus we see that there are great varieties of simple ideas, as of tastes and smells, which have no names, and of modes many more, which either not having been generally enough observed, or else not being of any great use to be taken notice of in the affairs and converse of men, they have not had names given to them, and so pass not for species. This we shall have occasion hereafter to consider more at large when we come to speak of words. Chapter 19 of the modes of thinking: sensation, remembrance, contemplation, etc. Okay, this is exciting. All right. When the mind turns its view inward upon itself. And I want to stretch. I want to sit down. I want to stretch. Oh. I want to give myself a nice back massage right now. I want to take a nice lacrosse ball and just dig into my back. But that's not going to happen right now because we have to keep reading Locke. Okay. Well, if we have to do that. Let me just prepare myself. Ba-bum, ba-ba-ba, ba-ba, ba-ba, ba-ba-ba. Okay. I think I am now ready, right? Is everybody ready? I think I'm ready. You just have to believe in yourself. That's it. When the mind turns its view inwards upon itself and contemplates its own actions, thinking is the first that occurs. In it, the mind observes a great variety of modifications and from thence receives distinct ideas, and thus the perception, which actually accompanies and is annexed to any impression on the body made by an external object, being distinct from all other modifications of thinking, furnishes the mind with a distinct idea, which we call sensation, which is, as it were, the actual entrance of an idea into the understanding by the senses. The same idea, when it again recurs without the operation of the like object on the external sensory, is remembrance. If it be sought after by the mind, and with pain and endeavor found, and brought again into view, it is recollection. If it be held there long under attentive consideration, it is contemplation. When ideas float in our mind, without any reflection or regard of the understanding, it is that which the French call réserve. Our language has scarce a name for it. When the ideas that offer themselves, for as I have observed in another place whilst we are awake, there will always be a train choo-choo of ideas succeeding one another in our minds, are taken notice of, and, as it were, registered in the memory it is attention. When the mind with great earnestness and of choice fixes its view on any idea, considers it on all sides, and will not be called off by the ordinary solicitation of other ideas, it is that we call intention or study. Sleep without dreaming is rest from all these, and dreaming itself is the having of ideas whilst the outward senses are stopped, so that they receive not outward objects with their usual quickness in the mind, not suggested by any external objects or known occasion, nor under any choice or conduct of the understanding at all. And whether that which we call ecstasy be not dreaming with the eyes open, I leave to be examined. There are some few instances of those various modes of thinking which the mind may observe in itself, and so have as distinct ideas of, as it hath of white and red, a square or a circle. I do not pretend to enumerate them all, nor to treat at large of this set of ideas which are got from reflection. That would be to make a volume. It suffices to my present purpose to have shown here, by some few examples, of what sort these ideas are, and how the mind comes by them, especially since I shall have occasion hereafter to treat more at large of reasoning, judging, volition, and knowledge, which are some of the most considerable operations of the mind and modes of thinking. But perhaps it may not be an unpardonable digression, nor wholly impertinent to our present design, if we reflect here upon the different state of the mind in thinking, which those instances of attention, reverie, and dreaming, etc., before mentioned, naturally enough suggest. That there are ideas, some or other, always present in the mind of a waking man. Everyone's experience convinces him, though the mind employs itself about them with several degrees of attention. Sometimes the mind fixes itself with so much earnestness on the contemplation of some objects that it turns their ideas on all sides, remarks their relations and circumstances, and views every part so nicely and with such attention that it shuts out all other thoughts and takes no notice of the ordinary impressions made then on the senses, which at another season would produce very sensible perceptions. At other times it barely observes the train of ideas that succeed in the understanding without directing and pursuing any of them, and at other times it lets them pass almost quite unregarded as faint shadows and make no impression. This difference of intention and remission of the mind in thinking, with a great variety of degrees between earnest study and very near minding nothing at all, everyone, I think, has experimented in himself. Trace it a little farther, and you find the mind asleep, retired as it were from the other senses, and out of the reach of those motions made on the organs of sense, which at other times produce very vivid and sensible ideas. I need not for this instance in those who sleep out whole stormy nights without hearing the thunder, or seeing the lightning, or feeling the shaking of the house, which are sensible enough to those who are waking. But in this retirement of the mind from the senses, it often retains a yet more loose and incoherent manner of thinking, which we call dreaming. And last of all, sound sleep closes the scene quite and puts an end to all appearances. This, I think, almost everyone has experience of in himself, in his own, and his own observation without difficulty leads him thus far. That which I would farther conclude from hence is that since the mind can sensibly put on at several times several degrees of thinking, and be sometimes even in a waking man so remiss as to have thoughts dim and obscure to that degree, that they are very little removed from none at all, and at last in the dark retirements of sound sleep loses the sight perfectly of all ideas whatsoever, since I say this is evidently so in matter of fact and constant experience, I ask whether it be not probable that thinking is the action and not the essence of the soul, since the operations of agents will easily admit of attention and remission, but the essences of things are not conceived capable of any such variation. But this by the by. Chapter 20. We're getting up there. We're getting up there, chapter 20. Time for a water break. Time to respect Roger Federer. Rest in peace, Roger Federer. Roger Federer, the greatest conservative philosopher of our age, and also a tennis champion. He will never die in our hearts. Oh, yeah. Okay. Chapter 20 of Modes of Pleasure and Pain. Amongst the simple ideas which we receive both from sensation and reflection, pain and pleasure are two very considerable ones. For as in the body there is sensation barely in itself or accompanied with pain or pleasure, so the thought or perception of the mind is simply so, or else accompanied also with pleasure or pain, delight or trouble, call it how you please. These, like other simple ideas, cannot be described nor their names defined. Excuse me. The way of knowing them is as of the simple ideas of the senses, only by experience. For to define them by the preference of good or evil, or is that presence? I'm not quite sure. Is it preference? No, it's presence. To define them by the presence of good or evil is no otherwise to make them known to us than by making us reflect on what we feel in ourselves upon the several and various operations of good and evil upon our minds, as they are differently applied to or considered by us. Things then are good or evil only in reference to pleasure or pain. That we call good, which is apt to cause or increase pleasure or diminish pain in us, or else to procure or preserve us the possession of any other good or absence of any evil. And on the contrary, we name that evil which is apt to produce or increase any pain or diminish any pleasure in us, or else to procure us any evil or deprive us of any good. So this is like some utilitarian hedonism here. By pleasure and pain, I must be understood to mean of body or mind, as they are commonly distinguished, though in truth they be only different constitutions of the mind, sometimes occasioned by disorder in the body, sometimes by thoughts of the mind. So pain is all in your head, pleasure is all in your head. Pleasure and pain and that which causes them, good and evil, are the hinges on which our passions turn, and if we reflect on ourselves and observe how these, under various considerations, operate in us, what modifications or tempers of mind, what internal sensations, if I may call them, they produce in us, we may thence form to ourselves the ideas of our passions. Thus, anyone reflecting upon the thought he has of the delight which any present or absent thing is apt to produce in him, has the idea we call love. For when a man declares in autumn, when he is eating them, or in spring, when there are none, that he loves grapes, I do love grapes, in fact, it is no more but that the taste of grapes delights him. Let an alteration of health or constitution destroy the delight of their taste, and he can then be said to love grapes no longer. On the contrary, the thought of the pain which anything present or absent is apt to produce in us is what we call hatred. Were it my business here to inquire any farther than into the bare ideas of our passions, as they depend on different modifications of pleasure and pain, I should remark that our love and hatred of inanimate, insensible beings is commonly founded on that pleasure and pain which we receive from their use and application anyway to our senses, though with their destruction. But hatred or love to beings capable of happiness or misery is often the uneasiness or delight which we find in ourselves, arising from a consideration of their very being or happiness. Thus the being and welfare of a man's children or friends, producing constant delight in him, he is said constantly to love them. But it suffices to note that our ideas of love and hatred are but the dispositions of the mind, in respect of pleasure and pain in general, however caused in us. The uneasiness a man finds in himself upon the absence of anything whose present enjoyment carries the idea of delight with it is that we call desire, which is greater or less as that uneasiness is more or less vehement. Whereby the by, it may perhaps be of some use to remark that the chief, if not only spur to human industry and action, is uneasiness. So this is very Schopenhauerian, the idea that life consists by this dissatisfied uneasiness, the will, which is the uneasiness of desire, and therefore life is suffering and desiring is suffering and uneasiness. For whatever good is proposed, if its absence carries no displeasure nor pain with it, if a man be easy and content without it, there is no desire of it nor endeavor after it. There is no more but a bare velleity. I'm not sure what that means. The term used to signify the lowest degree of desire, and that which is next to none at all, when there is so little uneasiness in the absence of anything that it carries a man no farther than some faint wishes for it, without any more effectual or rigorous use of the means to attain it. Desire also is stopped or abated by the opinion of the impossibility or unattainableness of the good proposed, as far as the uneasiness is cured or allayed by that consideration. This might carry our thoughts farther, were it seasonable in this place. Joy is a delight of the mind from the consideration of the present or assured approaching possession of a good, and we are then possessed of any good when we have it so in our power that we can use it when we please. Thus a man almost starved has joy at the arrival of relief, even before he has the pleasure of using it. And a father in whom the very well-being of his children causes delight is always, as long as his children are in such a state, in the possession of that good, for he needs but to reflect on it to have that pleasure. That's a very cute passage. Sorrow is uneasiness of the mind upon the thought of a good lost, which might have been enjoyed longer, or the sense of a present evil. Hope is that pleasure in the mind which everyone finds in him. I'm starting to tear up here. This is very emotional. Literally, this is cataloging the emotions, and it's making me emotional here. Hope is that pleasure in the mind. I think I need a drink of water here. I'm getting very emotional. Locke he's really tugging at my heartstrings here. You know. Okay. Hope is that pleasure in the mind which everyone finds in himself upon the thought of a profitable future enjoyment of a thing which is apt to delight him. Fear is an uneasiness of the mind upon the thought of future evil likely to befall us. Despair is the thought of the unattainableness of any good, which works differently in men's minds, sometimes producing uneasiness or pain, sometimes rest and indolency. Anger is an uneasiness or discomposure of the mind upon the receipt of any injury with a present purpose of revenge. Envy is an uneasiness of mind caused by the consideration of a good we desire, obtained by one we think should not have had it before us. These two last, envy and anger, not being caused by pain and pleasure simply in themselves, but having in them some mixed considerations of ourselves and others, are not therefore to be found in all men, because those other parts of valuing their merits or intending revenge is wanting in them. But all the rest, terminated purely in pain and pleasure, are, I think, to be found in all men. Excuse me. For we love, desire, rejoice, and hope only in respect of pleasure. We hate, fear, and grieve only in respect of pain ultimately. In fine, all these passions are moved by things only as they appear to be the causes of pleasure and pain, or to have pleasure or pain some way or other annexed to them. Thus we extend our hatred usually to the subject, at least if a sensible or voluntary agent which has produced pain in us, because the fear it leaves is a constant pain. But we do not so constantly love what has done us good, because pleasure operates not so strongly on us as pain, and because we are not so ready to have hope it will do so again. But this by the by. By pleasure and pain, delight and uneasiness, I must all along be understood, as I have above intimated, to mean not only bodily pain and pleasure, but whatsoever delight or uneasiness is felt by us, whether arising from any grateful or unacceptable sensation or reflection. 'Tis farther to be considered that in reference to the passions, the removal or lessening of a pain is considered and operates as a pleasure, and the loss or diminishing of a pleasure as a pain. The passions, too, have most of them in most persons operations on the body and cause various changes in it, which, not being always sensible, do not make a necessary part of the idea of each passion. For shame, which is an uneasiness of the mind upon the thought of having done something which is indecent, or will lessen the valued esteem which others have for us, has not always blushing accompanying it. I would not be mistaken here, as if I meant this as a discourse of the passions. They are many more than those I have here named, and those I have taken notice of, which would each of them require a much larger and more accurate discourse. I have only mentioned these here as so many instances of modes of pleasure and pain resulting in our minds from various considerations of good and evil. I might perhaps have instanced in other modes of pleasure and pain more simple than these, as the pain of hunger and thirst, and the pleasure of eating and drinking to remove them, and the pain of tender eyes, and the pleasure of music, pain from capacious and unintrusive wrangling, and the pleasure of rational conversation with a friend, or of well-directed study in the search and discovery of truth. But the passions being of much more concernment to us, I rather made choice to instance in them and show how the ideas we have of them are derived from sensation and reflection. Chapter 21 of Power. The mind being every day informed by the senses of the alteration of those simple ideas it observes in things without, and taking notice how one comes to an end and ceases to be, and another begins to exist which was not before, reflecting also on what passes within itself, and observing a constant change of its ideas, sometimes by the impression of the outward objects of the senses, and sometimes by the determination of its own choice, and concluding from what it has so constantly observed to have been, that the like changes will for the future be made in the same things by like agents and by the like ways, considers in one thing the possibility of having any of its simple ideas changed, and in another the possibility of making that change, and so comes by that idea which we call power. Thus we say fire has a power to melt gold, i.e. to destroy the consistency of its insensible parts, and consequently its hardness, and make it fluid. And gold has a power to be melted, that the sun has a power to blanch wax, and wax has a power to be blanched by the sun, whereby the yellowness is destroyed and whiteness made to exist in its room, in which and the like cases the power we consider is in reference to the change of perceivable ideas, for we cannot observe any alteration to be made in or operation upon anything but by the observable change of its sensible ideas, nor conceive any alteration to be made but by conceiving a change of some of its ideas. Power, thus considered, is twofold, vis-a-vis as ability to make or ability to receive any change. The one may be called active and the other called passive power. Whether matter be not wholly destitute of active power, as its author God is truly above all passive power, and whether the intermediate state of created spirits be not that alone that is capable of both active and passive power, may be worth consideration. I shall not now enter into that enquiry, my present business being not to search into the original of power, but how we come by the idea of it. But since active powers make so great a part of our complex ideas of natural substances, as we shall see hereafter, and I mention them as such, according to common apprehension, yet they being not perhaps so truly active powers as our hasty thoughts are apt to represent them, I judge it not amiss by this intimation to direct our minds to the consideration of God and spirits for the clearest idea of active power. So this is actually very interesting. So when we talk about gold melting at a certain temperature due to heat or flame or fire, it is actually the attributes of the gold itself, which is a certain melting point at a certain energy level. So really the melting of the gold, you could say it is acted upon by the fire in such a way as to become liquid. That is determined by the attributes of the gold itself and not determined by the temperature of the fire. Whereupon we could have the same temperature of fire and apply it to steel or lead or some other metal, or to clay or iron or copper or tin or any other mineral. We could apply the same temperature of fire and the same heat and yet produce different levels of liquidity. We could produce a quicker liquidity or a slower liquidity. We could produce no liquidity at all in some cases of some materials which resist that heating and that fire. And so the active power of the fire itself is in a way impotent to change the melting point of the gold, of the tin, of the copper, of the lead. All of these things melt with unto their own accord. All of these things melt by their own melting points and not according to the fire. And so the power of melting is within the material itself and not within the fire, which merely allows the expression of some potentiality which is bound up within that element. Now, of course, all of these elements are made up of electrons, protons, and neutrons, which determine their attributes, their melting points, and so on, that give them their own passive power. And so to speak of active power and passive power, this is very interesting when we think of a person's capacity for change, that I can thrust Locke upon you, and yet you shall not change, you shall not better your life or learn or make use of Locke. And yet another, with a grade of passive power for learning and understanding, I could thrust Locke upon him, and but a little bit of Locke would enlighten him and bring him into a more brilliant understanding of the world. And in this way, we understand that at all times around us, there are several choices we might make whereby we expose ourselves to edification, whether of Locke or whether of schooling or of online materials. We might edify ourselves with our limited times here on the earth. And those who have a passive power for edification, that is, those who easily learn and who are easily educated by the exposure of external materials upon them through lecture or through reading, those who more easily learn are more apt to seek out learning, whereas those who learn more slowly, who are slow to learn, do not easily seek out learning and are not apt to seek it because they do not see its effect. When we read Locke, if an intelligent person reads Locke, then they are affected by Locke because they understand Locke. Whereas if a dumb person reads Locke, they are not affected. It is blabber, it is unintelligible, it is boring, right? And so what we see here is that the intelligence of a person determines their willingness to seek out those things which are edifying. A dumb person will not seek out Locke because a dumb person cannot understand Locke or understands so in a slower manner. Whereas a person who is more intelligent, who understands Locke more quickly and more readily, will seek out edifying materials more promptly and with more vigor and gains more enjoyment, because the person who learns slowly does not enjoy the process of learning, which is for them boring, whereas the person who learns quickly soon attains the good taste and the good feeling which learning confers, of understanding new ideas. In the same way that if we were to take old people without teeth and we were to present them with different sorts of food, so if we presented them with soft food, which they could readily chew and swallow, and alternatively, if we produced to them hard food, which was crunchy and difficult to chew and difficult to swallow, which would they choose? They would choose the soft food and not the hard food. And yet for a person with teeth, they might make another evaluation. They might choose the hard food over the soft food because perhaps for them the hard food was tastier or provided more nutrition or made them feel better. And so our mind is like a set of teeth which we use to chew and dissect ideas, and which changes our ability to perceive something as useful or not. And so the intelligence of a person is determined essentially, or correlates with, the extent to which they find edifying materials to be boring or not. So a person who finds something to be boring, they're going to turn away from Locke. They're going to click on the video, maybe they like the video, dislike the video, or nothing at all, and then they leave. Whereas the person who is intelligent, perhaps they don't even watch the stream at all, but they have already read Locke and they have already digested Locke long ago because they had heard of him and they were interested in him. And so they spent a few afternoons here and there reading Locke at a quicker pace than I can speak. And they apprehended the ideas of Locke and they considered them on their merits, and they integrated them into their own worldview and historical understanding of the progress of philosophy from the time of Plato up to the present. And they were edified because of their passive power for edification. Locke, as a text, I'm referring to here as a dead man, has no active power to force edification upon us, but we have the passive power to receive Locke. Others do not have this passive power. And this is a spectrum of powers, just as there are a spectrum of metals which may melt. The tin and the copper and the iron and the steel and the gold, they all melt at various degrees under different temperatures. And if we apply the same temperature to each of them, we will achieve different levels of liquidity. In the same way, if I thrust Locke upon my audience, he will be absorbed, he will be digested, he will be understood or apprehended to various degrees by different members of the audience. And some members of the audience, more intelligent than me, will more readily understand Locke and have already understood him, have already comprehended him, and have even moved beyond him. So what we're seeing here is a spectrum of passive power, whereas Locke has no active power to force edification on us. So the whole concept of educating humanity, whether morally or intellectually, really depends upon the passive powers of men to be edified and not on the active powers of the educator. You could have the best educator in the world, whether it's Locke or otherwise, trying to teach us what is good and bad, what is right and wrong, what is true and false, and yet if we do not have the passive power to comprehend him, then we shall never comprehend him, no matter how powerful his active power for edification was. Do we understand here then that most people are going to engage in activity which is at their level of understanding, and they will never seek those things which are outside of their level of difficulty? It will suffice for them to continue in the consumption of media and ideas which do not edify them morally, which do not edify them intellectually, but which make them feel familiar or make them feel pleasure for whatever reason. They see some limited newness of the idea of a drama, of a social situation, and they see no further. So that's a little diatribe there. We should get back to the reading, though. Where are we? Active and passive powers. Active powers make so great a part in our complex ideas of natural substances, as we shall see hereafter, and I mention them as such according to common apprehension, yet they being not perhaps so truly active powers as our hasty thoughts are apt to represent them, I judge it not amiss by this intimation to direct our minds to the consideration of God and spirits for the clearest idea of active power. So that's another interesting thing, the concept that God has actively, through his power, created and enumerated these different passive powers of material reality. Or even prior to material reality, of logic, that God created logic, which then is passive as an attribute within all of the objects of metaphysics. I confess power includes in it some kind of relation or relation to action or change. I confess power includes in it some kind of relation, a relation to action or change, as indeed which of our ideas, of what kind soever, when attentively, how do I read this word correctly? When attentively considered, does not. For ideas of extension, duration, and number, do they not all contain in them a siret? I don't know what a siret is, or is that a secret? A secret relation to the parts. Figure and motion have something relative to them so much more visible, and sensible qualities as colors and smells, etc. What are they but the powers of different bodies in relation to our perception, etc.? And if considered in the things themselves, do they not depend on the bulk, figure, texture, and motion of the parts, all which conclude some kind of relation in them? Our idea, therefore, of power, I think, may well have a place amongst other simple ideas, and be considered as one of them, being one of those that make a principal ingredient in our complex ideas of substances, as we shall hereafter have occasion to observe. We are abundantly furnished with the idea of passive power by almost all sorts of sensible things. In most of them, we cannot avoid observing their sensible qualities, nay, their very substances, to be in a continual flux, and therefore with reason we look on them as liable still to the same change. Nor have we of active power, which is the more proper signification of the word power, fewer instances, since whatever change is observed, the mind must collect a power somewhere able to make that change, as well as a possibility in the thing itself to receive it. But yet if we will consider it attentively, bodies by our senses do not afford us so clear and distinct an idea of active power as we have from reflection of the operation of our minds. For all power relating to action, and there being but two sorts of action whereof we have any idea vis-a-vis thinking and motion, let us consider whence we have the clearest ideas of the powers which produce these actions. Number 1, of thinking. Body affords us no idea at all. It is only from reflection that we have that. Number 2, neither have we from body any idea of the beginning of motion. A body at rest affords us no idea of any active power to move, and when it is set in motion itself, that motion is rather a passion than an action in it. For when the ball obeys the stroke of a billiard stick, it is not any action of the ball, but bare passion. Also, when by impulse it sets another ball in motion that lay in its way, it only communicates the motion it had received from another, and loses in itself so much as the other received, which gives but a very obscure idea of an active power of moving in body, whilst we observe it only to transfer, but not produce any motion, for it is but a very obscure idea of power, which reaches not the production of the action, but the continuation of the passion. For so is motion in a body impelled by another, the continuation of the alteration made in it from rest to motion being little more than an action, then the continuation of the alteration of its figure by the same blow is an action. The idea of the beginning of motion we have only from reflection on what passes in ourselves, where we find by experience that barely by willing it, barely by a thought of the mind, we can move the parts of our bodies which were before at rest, so that it seems to me we have from the observation of the operation of bodies by our senses but a very imperfect, obscure idea of active power, since they afford us not any idea in themselves of the power to begin any action, either motion or thought. But if from the impulse bodies are observed to make one upon another, anyone thinks he has a clear idea of power, it serves as well to my purpose, sensation being one of those ways whereby the mind comes by its ideas. Only I thought it worthwhile to consider here, by the way, whether the mind doth not receive its idea of active power clearer from reflection on its own operations than it doth from any external sensation. This, at least, I think evident, that we find in ourselves a power to begin or forbear, continue, or end several actions of our minds and motions of our bodies barely by a thought or preference of the mind, ordering or as it were commanding the doing or not doing such or such a particular action. This power which the mind has thus to order the consideration of any idea, or the forbearing to consider it, or to prefer the motion of any part of the body to its rest, and vice versa, in any particular instance, is that which we call the will. The actual exercise of that power by directing any particular action or its forbearance is that which we call volition or willing. The forbearance of that action consequent to such order or command of the mind is called voluntary, and whatsoever action is performed without such a thought of the mind is called involuntary. The power of perception is that which we call the understanding. Perception, which we make the act of the understanding, is of three sorts. 1. Perception of ideas in our minds. 2. The perception of the signification of signs. 3. The perception of the connection or repugnancy, agreement or disagreement that there is between any of our ideas. All these are attributed to the understanding or perceptive power, though it be the two latter only that use allows us to say we understand. These powers of the mind vis-a-vis of perceiving and of preferring are usually called by another name, and the ordinary way of speaking is that the understanding and will are two faculties of the mind, a word proper enough if it be used as all words should be, so as not to breed any confusion in men's thoughts, by being supposed, as I suspect it has been, to stand for some real beings in the soul that performed those actions of understanding and volition. For when we say the will is the commanding and superior faculty of the soul, that it is or is not free, that it determines the inferior faculties, that it follows the dictates of the understanding, etc., though these and the like expressions by those that carefully attend to their own ideas and conduct their thoughts more by the evidence of things than the sounds of words may be understood in a clear and distinct sense, yet I suspect, I say, that this way of speaking of faculties has misled many into a confused notion of so many distinct agents in us, which had their several provinces and authorities, and did command, obey, and perform several actions as so many distinct beings, which has been no small occasion of wrangling, obscurity, and uncertainty in questions relating to them. Everyone, I think, finds in himself a power to begin or forbear, continue, or put an end to several actions in himself. From the consideration of the extent of this power of the mind over the actions of the man, which everyone finds in himself, arise the ideas of liberty and necessity. All the ideas, all the actions that we have any idea of reducing themselves, as has been said, to these two vis-a-vis thinking and motion, so far as a man has power to think or not to think, to move or not to move according to the preference and direction of his own mind, so far as a man is free. Wherever any performance or forbearance are not equally in a man's power, wherever doing or not doing will not equally follow upon the preference of his mind directing it, there he is not free, though perhaps the action may be voluntary. So that the idea of liberty is the idea of a power in any agent to do or forbear any particular action, according to the determination or thought of the mind, whereby either of them is preferred to the other, where either of them is not in the power of the agent to be produced by him according to his volition, there he is not at liberty, that agent is under necessity. So that liberty cannot be where there is no thought, no volition, no will, but there may be thought, there may be will, there may be volition, where there is no liberty. A little consideration of an obvious instance or two may make this clear. A tennis ball, whether in motion by the stroke of a racket or lying still at rest, is not by any taken to be a free agent. If we inquire into the reason, we should find it is because we conceive not a tennis ball to think, and consequently not to have any volition or preference of motion to rest or vice versa. And therefore has not liberty, is not a free agent, but all its both motion and rest come under our idea of necessary and are so called. Likewise, a man falling into the water, a bridge breaking under him, has not herein liberty, is not a free agent. For though he has volition, though he prefers his not falling to falling, yet the forbearance of that motion not being in his power, the stop or cessation of that motion follows not upon his volition, and therefore therein he is not free. So a man striking himself or his friend by a convulsive motion of his arm, which it is not in his power by volition or the direction of his mind to stop or forbear, nobody thinks he has this liberty. Everyone pities him as acting by necessity and constraint. Again, suppose a man be carried whilst fast asleep into a room where is a person he longs to see and speak with, and be there locked fast in, beyond his power to get out, he awakens, and is glad to find himself in so desirable company, which he stays willingly in, i.e. prefers his stay to going away. I ask, is not his stay voluntary? I think nobody will doubt it, and yet being locked fast in, 'tis evident he is not at liberty not to stay, he has not freedom to be gone. And so that liberty is not an idea belonging to volition or preferring, but to the person having the power of doing or forbearing to do according as the mind shall choose or direct. So he's saying that you can have volition to do something even if there is no alternative. Our idea of liberty reaches as far as that power and no farther. For wherever restraint comes to check that power or compulsion takes away that indifferency of ability on either side to act or to forbear acting, their liberty and our notion of it presently ceases. We have instances enough and often more than enough in our own bodies. A man's heart beats and the blood circulates, which 'tis not in his power by any thought or volition to stop, and therefore in respect of these motions, where rest depends not on his choice, nor would follow the determination of his mind, if it should prefer it, he is not a free agent. Convulsive motions agitate his legs, for that though he wills it never so much, he cannot by any power of his mind stop their motion, as in that odd disease called chorea sancti viti. But he is perpetually dancing. He is not at liberty in this action, but under as much necessity of moving as a stone that falls or a tennis ball struck with a racket. On the other side, a palsy or the stocks hinder his legs from obeying the determination of his mind, if it would thereby transfer his body to another place. In all these there is a want of freedom, though the sitting still even of a paralytic, whilst he prefers it to a removal, is truly voluntary. Voluntary then is not opposed to necessary, but to involuntary. For a man may prefer what he can do to what he cannot do, the state he is in to its absence or change, though necessity has made it itself unalterable. As it is so in a sense, if God is a slave master, has put us in this universe and we have no escape, we can assent to this universe, to agree to the universe, to say yes to where we are, and thereby we become free because we are where we want to be. In the sense that we have a slave master over us who says, do this and do that, you can do this, you can't do that. If we are in rebellion against God, then we are not free, we are truly slaves. But Locke is saying that as soon as we assent, and as soon as we love and like and want where we are, that is when we become free. That is when we attain liberty. So you can disagree with that definition, but it is an interesting one. As it is in the motions of the body, so it is in the thoughts of our minds, where anyone is such that we have power to take it up or lay it by according to the preference of the mind. There we are at liberty. A waking man, being under the necessity of having some ideas constantly in his mind, is not at liberty to think or not to think, no more than he is at liberty whether his body should touch any other or no. But whether he will remove his Geez, I have a splinter in my finger. That's not cool. That's very annoying. Anyway, but whether he will remove his contemplation from one idea to another is many times in his choice, and then he is in respect of his ideas at much at liberty as he is in respect of bodies he rests on. He can at pleasure remove himself from one to another. But yet some ideas to the mind, like some motions to the body, are such as in certain circumstances it cannot avoid, nor obtain their absence by the utmost effort it can use. A man on the rack is not at liberty to lay by the idea of pain and divert himself with other contemplations. And sometimes a boisterous passion hurries our thoughts, as a hurricane does our bodies, without leaving us the liberty of thinking on other things which we would rather choose. But as soon as the mind regains the power to stop or continue, begins to forbear any of these motions of the body without or thoughts within, according as it thinks fit to prefer either to the other, we then consider the man as a free agent again. So there's an interesting implication here that that if you could, through a Buddhist meditation, choose whether or not to feel pain, then you would be a freer man in greater liberty, according to Locke. And so, as Nietzsche says, the quest of the priest is to attain liberty and freedom, agency over his own sense of pleasure and pain. Through these removals of pleasures and through the additions of pain, he trains himself to be at liberty with respect to his mind. Wherever thought is wholly wanting or the power to act or forbear according to the direction of thought, their necessity takes place. Thus, an agent capable of volition, when the beginning or continuation of any action is contrary to that preference of his mind, is called compulsion. When the hindering or stopping any action is contrary to his volition, it is called restraint. Agents that have no thought, no volition at all, are in everything necessary agents. If this be so as I imagine it is, I leave it to be considered whether it may not help to put an end to that long agitated and I think unreasonable because unintelligible question vis-a-vis whether man's will be free or no. For if I mistake not, it follows from what I have said that the question itself is altogether improper, and it is as insignificant to ask whether man's will be free as to ask whether his sleep be swift or his virtue square, liberty being as little applicable to the will as swiftness of motion is to sleep or squareness to virtue. Everyone would laugh at the absurdity of such a question as either of these, because it is obvious that the modifications of motion belong not to sleep, nor the difference of figure to virtue. And when anyone well considers it, I think he will as plainly perceive that liberty, which is but a power, belongs only to agents, and cannot be an attribute or modification of the will, which is also but a power. Such as the difficulty of explaining and giving clear notions of internal actions by sounds, that I must here warn my reader that ordering, directing, choosing, preferring, etc., which I have made use of, will not distinctly enough express volition, unless he will reflect on what he himself does when he wills. For example, preferring, which seems perhaps best to express the action of volition, does it not precisely. Though a man would prefer flying to walking, yet who can say he ever wills it? Volition, 'tis plain, is an act of the mind, knowingly exerting that dominion it takes to itself to have over any part of the man by employing it in or withholding it from any particular action. And what is the will but the faculty to do this? And is that faculty any more in effect than a power, the power of the mind to determine its thought, to the producing, continuing, or stopping any action as far as it depends on us? For can it be denied that whatever agent has a power to think on its own action and to prefer their doing or omission either to other, has that faculty called will? Will then is nothing but such a power. Liberty, on the other side, is the power a man has to do or forbear doing any particular action according as its doing or forbearance has the actual preference in the mind, which is the same thing as to say, according as he himself wills it. 'Tis plain then that will is nothing but one power or ability, and freedom another power and ability. So that to ask whether the will has freedom is to ask whether one power has another power, one ability another ability. A question at first sight too grossly absurd to make a dispute or need an answer. For who is it that sees not that powers belong only to agents and are attributes only of substances and not of powers themselves? So that this way of putting the question of vis-a-vis whether the will be free is in effect to ask whether the will be a substance and agent, or at least to suppose it, since freedom can properly be attributed to nothing else. If freedom can be with any propriety of speech be applied to power, it may be attributed to the power that is in a man to produce or forbear producing motion in parts of his body by choice or preference, which is that which denominates him free and is freedom itself. But if anyone should ask whether freedom were free, he would be suspected not to understand well what he said, and he would be thought to deserve Midas's ears, who, knowing that rich was a denomination from the possession of riches, should demand whether riches themselves were rich. Freedom isn't free. However, the name faculty, which men have given to this power called the will, and whereby they have been led into a way of talking of the will as acting, may, by an appropriation that disguises its true sense, serve a little to palliate the absurdity, yet the will in truth signifies nothing but a power or ability to prefer or choose. And when the will under the name of a faculty is considered, as it is barely as an ability to do something, the absurdity in saying it is free or not free will easily discover itself. For if it be reasonable to suppose and talk of faculties as distinct beings that can act as we do, when we say the will orders and the will is free, 'tis fit that we should make a speaking faculty and a walking faculty and a dancing faculty, by which those actions are produced, which are but several modes of motion, as well as we make the will and understanding to be faculties, by which the actions of choosing and perceiving are produced, which are but several modes of thinking. And we may as properly say 'tis the singing faculty sings, and the dancing faculty dances, as that the will chooses, or that the understanding conceives, or as is usual that the will directs the understanding, or the understanding obeys or obeys not the will, it being altogether as proper and intelligible to say that the power of speaking directs the power of singing, or the power of singing obeys or disobeys the power of speaking. This way of talking nevertheless has prevailed, and as I guess, produced great confusion. For these being all different powers in the mind or in the man to do several actions, he exerts them as he thinks fit. But the power to do one action is not operated on by the power of doing another action. For the power of thinking operates not on the power of choosing, nor the power of choosing on the power of thinking, no more than the power of dancing operates on the power of singing, or the power of singing on the power of dancing, as anyone who reflects on it will easily perceive. And yet this is it which we say when we thus speak, that the will operates on the understanding, or the understanding on the will. So I disagree with Locke. I think there is an element of choosing in thinking, and what we, if we have volition and will, we direct it towards certain patterns of thought and not others. There's some kind of passivity here in what he's saying. I grant that this or that actual thought may be the occasion of volition, or exercising the power a man has to choose, or the actual choice of the mind, the cause of actual thinking on this or that thing, as the actual singing of such a tune may be the occasion of dancing such a tune, and the actual dancing of such a tune the occasion of singing such a tune. But in all these, it is not one power that operates on another, but it is the mind that operates and exerts these powers. It is the man that does the action. It is the agent that has power, or is able to do. For powers are relations, not agents, and that which has the power or not the power to operate is that alone which is or is not free, and not the power itself. For freedom or not freedom can belong to nothing but what has or has not a power to act. The attributing to faculties that which belonging not to them has given occasion to this way of talking. But the introducing into discourses concerning the mind with the name of faculties and notion of their operating has, I suppose, as little advanced our knowledge in that part of ourselves as the great use and mention of the like invention of faculties and the operations of the body has helped us in the knowledge of physic. Not that I deny there are faculties both in the body and the mind. They both of them have their powers of operating, else neither the one nor the other could operate. For nothing can operate that is not able to operate, and that is not able to operate that has no power to operate. Nor do I deny that those words and the like are to have their place in the common use of languages that have made them current. It looks like too much affection wholly to lay them by, and philosophy itself, though it likes not a gaudy dress, yet when it appears in public must have so much complacency as to be clothed in the ordinary fashion and language of the country, so far as it can consist with truth and perspicuity. But the fault has been that faculties have been spoken of and represented as so many distinct agents. For it being asked what it was that digested the meat in our stomachs, it was a ready and very satisfactory answer to say that it was the digestive faculty. What was it that made anything come out of the body? The expulsive faculty. What moved? the motive faculty. And so in the mind, the intellectual faculty or the understanding, understood, and the elective faculty or the will, willed, or commanded, which is in short to say that the ability to digest, digested, the ability to move, moved, the ability to understand, understood. For faculty, ability, and power, I think, are but different names of the same things, which ways of speaking, when put into more intelligible words, will, I think, amount to thus much: that digestion is performed by something that is able to digest, motion by something able to move, and understanding by something able to understand. And in truth, it would be very strange if it should be otherwise, as strange as it would be for a man to be free without being able to be free. To return then to the enquiry about liberty, I think the question is not proper whether the will be free, or but whether a man be free. Thus, I think that so far as anyone can, by the direction or choice of his mind, preferring the existence of any action to the non-existence of that action, and vice versa, make it to exist or not exist, so far he is free. For if I can by a thought directing the motion of my finger make it move when it was at rest, or vice versa, 'tis evident that in respect of that I am free. And if I can by a light thought of my mind, preferring one to the other, produce either words or silence, I am at liberty to speak or hold my peace. And as far as this power reaches of acting or not acting by the determination of his own thought, preferring either, so far is a man free. For how can we think anyone freer than to have the power to do what he will? And so far as anyone can, by preferring any action to its not being, or rest to any action, produce that action or rest, so far he can do what he will. For such a preferring of action to its absence is the willing of it, and we can scarce tell how to imagine any being freer than to be able to do what he will. So that in respect of actions within the reach of such a power in him, a man seems as free as 'tis possible for freedom to make him. So this is like some Aleister Crowley, do what thou wilt idea of free, if freedom is a good thing here. But the inquisite mind of man willing to shift off from himself as far as he can all thoughts of guilt, though it be by putting himself into a worse state than that of fatal necessity, is not content with this. Freedom, unless it reaches farther than this, will not serve the turn. And it passes for a good plea that a man is not free at all, if he be not as free to will as he is to act what he wills. Concerning a man's liberty, therefore is raised this farther question, whether a man be free to will, which I think is what is meant when it is disputed whether the will be free. And as to that, I imagine that willing or volition being an action, and freedom consisting in a power of acting or not acting, a man in respect of willing or the act of volition, when any action in his power is once proposed to his thoughts as presently to be done, cannot be free. Excuse me. This is interesting. So, will and freedom here coming in contradiction. The reason whereof is very manifest, for it being unavoidable that the action depending on his will should exist or not exist, and its existence or not existence following perfectly the determination and preference of his will, he cannot avoid willing the existence or not existence of that action. It is absolutely necessary that he will the one or the other, i.e., prefer the one to the other, since one of them must necessarily follow, and that which does follow follows by the choice and determination of his mind, that is, by his willing it. For if he did not will it, it would not be. So that in respect of the act of willing, a man in such a case is not free, liberty consisting in a power to act or not to act, which in regard of volition a man upon such a proposition has not. For it is unavoidably necessary to prefer the doing or forbearance of an action in a man's power, which is once so proposed to his thoughts, a man must necessarily will the one or the other of them, upon which preference or volition the action or its forbearance certainly follows and is truly voluntary. But the act of volition or preferring one of the two, being that which he cannot avoid, a man in respect of that act of willing is under a necessity, and so cannot be free unless necessity and freedom can consist together, and a man can be free and bound at once. This then is evident that in all proposals of present action, a man is not at liberty to will or not to will because he cannot forbear willing. Liberty consisting in a power to act or to forbear acting, and in that only. For a man that sits still is said yet to be at liberty, because he can walk if he wills it. But if a man sitting still has not power to remove himself, he is not at liberty. So likewise, a man falling down a precipice, though in motion, is not at liberty, because he cannot stop that motion if he would. This being so, 'tis plain that a man that is walking, to whom it is proposed to give off walking, is not at liberty whether he will determine himself to walk or give off walking or no. He must necessarily prefer one or t'other of them, walking or not walking, and so it is in regard of all other actions in our power so proposed, which are the far greater number. For considering the vast number of voluntary actions that succeed one another every moment that we are awake in the course of our lives, there are but few of them that are thought on or proposed to the will till the time they are to be done. And in all such actions, as I have shown, the mind in respect of willing has not a power to act or not to act, wherein consists liberty. The mind in that case has not a power to forbear willing. It cannot avoid some determination concerning them. Let the consideration be as short, the thought as quick as it will. It either leaves the man in the state he was before thinking, or changes it, continues the action, or puts an end to it, whereby it is manifest that it orders and directs one in preference to or with neglect of the other, and thereby either the continuation or change becomes unavoidably voluntary. Since then it is plain that in most cases a man is not at liberty, whether he will or no, the next thing demanded is whether a man be at liberty to will which of the two he pleases, motion or rest. Get a nice neck crack in here. Getting stiff. This question carries the absurdity of it so manifestly in itself that one might thereby sufficiently be convinced that liberty concerns not the will. For to ask whether a man be at liberty to will either motion or rest, speaking or silence, which he pleases, is to ask whether a man can will what he wills, or be pleased with what he is pleased with, a question which I think needs no answer, and they who can make a question of it must suppose one will to determine the acts of another, and another to determine that, and so on in infinitum. This is interesting because, again, the priest tries to change his wills to will things that he does not want to will, to love pain and to hate pleasure. That is the priestly will, I suppose. But I guess the Lockean and Nietzschean argument would be that, but ultimately this itself is a will, and we can never precede our will or extinguish our will, which is the object of Buddhism. To avoid these and the like absurdities, nothing can be of greater use than to establish in our mind determined ideas of the things under consideration. If the ideas of liberty and volition were well fixed in our understandings and carried along with us in our minds as they ought, through all the questions that are raised about them, I suppose a great part of the difficulties that perplex men's thoughts and entangle their understandings would be much easier resolved, and we should perceive where the confused signification of terms or where the nature of the thing caused the obscurity. First, then, it is carefully to be remembered that freedom consists in the dependence of the existence or not existence of any action upon our volition of it, and not in the dependence of any action or its contrary on our preference. A man standing on a cliff is at liberty to leap 20 yards downwards into the sea, not because he has a power to do by the contrary action, which is to leap 20 yards upwards, for that he cannot do. But he is therefore free because he has a power to leap or not to leap. But if a greater force than this either holds him fast or tumbles him down, he is no longer free in that case, because the doing or forbearance of that particular action is no longer in his power. He that is a close prisoner in a room 20 foot square, being at the north side of his chamber, is at liberty to walk 20 foot southward because he can walk or not walk, but is not at the same time at liberty to do the contrary, to walk 20 foot northward. In this, then, consists freedom vis-a-vis in our being able to act or not to act according as we shall choose or will. Secondly, we must remember that volition or willing is an act of the mind directing its thought to the production of any action and thereby exerting its power to produce it. To avoid multiplying of words, I would crave leave here under the word action to comprehend the forbearance too of any action proposed, sitting still or holding one's peace when walking or speaking are proposed, though mere forbearances requiring as much the determination of the will as being often as weighty in their consequences as the contrary actions may, on that consideration, well enough pass for actions too. But this I say that I may not be mistaken, if for brevity's sake I speak thus. Thirdly, the will being nothing but a power in the mind to direct the operative faculties of a man to motion or rest as far as they depend on such direction. To the question, what is it that determines the will? The true and proper answer is the mind. For that which determines the general power of directing to this or that particular direction is nothing but the agent itself exercising the power it has that particular way. If this answer satisfies not, 'tis plain the meaning of the question, what determines the will, is this: what moves the mind in every particular instance to determine its general power of directing to this or that particular motion of rest? And to this I answer, the motive for continuing it in the same state or action is only the present satisfaction in it. The motive to change is always some uneasiness, nothing setting upon us the change of state or upon any new action, but some uneasiness. This is the great motive that works in the mind to put it upon action, which for shortness' sake we will call determining of the will, which I shall more at large explain. But in the way to it, it will be necessary to premise that though I have above endeavored to express the act of volition by choosing, preferring, and the like terms that signify desire as well as volition, for want of other words to mark that act of the mind, whose proper name is willing or volition, yet it being a very simple act, whosoever desires to understand what it is will better find it by reflecting on his own mind. Oh boy, this page is a little bit girthy. We gotta zoom out here. Give me that zoom. Give me that zoom. Oh boy, girthy page here. Girth alert. Reflecting on his own mind and observing what it does when it wills, than by any variety of articulate sounds whatsoever. This caution of being careful not to be misled by expressions that do not enough keep up the difference between the will and several acts of the mind that are quite distinct from it, I think the more necessary, because I find the will often confounded with several of the affections, especially desire, and one put for the other, and that by men who would not willingly be thought not to have very distinct notions of things, and not to have writ very clearly about them. This, I imagine, has been no small occasion of obscurity and mistake in this matter, and therefore is as much as may be to be avoided. For he that shall turn his thoughts inwards upon what passes in his mind when he wills shall see that the will or power of volition is conversant about nothing but that particular determination of the mind, whereby barely by a thought the mind endeavors to give rise, continuation, or stop to any action which it takes to be in its power. This, well considered, plainly shows that the will is perfectly distinguished from desire, which in the very same action may have a quite contrary tendency from that which our wills set us upon. A man whom I cannot deny may oblige me to use persuasions to another, which at the same time I am speaking, I may with may not prevail on him. In this case, 'tis plain the will and desire run counter. I will the action that tends one way, whilst my desire tends another, and the direct contrary. A man who by a violent fit of the gout in his limbs finds a dizziness in his head, or a doziness in his head, or a want of appetite in his stomach removed, desires to be eased too of the pain of his feet or hands, for wherever there is pain, there is a desire to be rid of it. though yet whilst he apprehends that the removal of the pain may translate the noxious humor, I'm guessing that's humor, to a more vital part, his will is never determined to any one action that may serve to remove this pain. Whence it is evident that desiring or willing are two distinct acts of the mind, and consequently that the will, which is but the power of volition, is much more distinct from desire. To return then to the inquiry, what is that determines the will in regard to our actions, and that upon second thoughts I am apt to imagine is not, and is generally supposed the greater good in view, but some, and for the most part the most pressing uneasiness a man is at present under. This is that which successively determines the will, and sets upon those actions we perform. This uneasiness we call as it is desire, which is an uneasiness of the mind for want of some absent good. All pain of the body, of what sort forever, and disquiet of the mind is uneasiness, and with this is always joined desire, equal to the pain or uneasiness felt, and is scarce distinguishable from it. For desire being nothing but an uneasiness in the want of an absent good, in reference to any pain felt, ease is that absent good. Until that be attained, we may call it desire. Nobody feeling pain that he wishes not to be eased of, with a desire equal to that pain and inseparable from it. Besides this desire of ease from pain, there is another of absent positive good, and here also the desire and uneasiness is equal. As much as we desire any absent good, so much are we in pain for it. But here all absent good does not, according to the greatness it has, or is acknowledged to have, cause pain equal to that greatness, as all pain causes desire equal to itself, because the absence of good is not always a pain, as the presence of pain is. And therefore absent good may be looked on and considered without desire. But so much as there is anywhere of desire, so much there is of uneasiness. That desire is a state of uneasiness everyone who reflects on himself will quickly find. Who is there that has not felt in desire what the wise man says of hope, which is not much different from it, that it being deferred makes the heart sick, and that still proportionable to the greatness of the desire, which sometimes raises the uneasiness to that pitch, that it makes people cry out, "Give me children, give me the thing desired, or I die." Life itself and all its enjoyments as a burden cannot be borne under the lasting and unremoved pressure of such an uneasiness. Good and evil, present and absent, 'tis true, work upon the mind. But that which immediately determines the will from time to every voluntary action is the uneasiness of desire fixed on some absent good, either negative as indolency to one in pain, or positive as enjoyment of pleasure. That is this uneasiness that determines the will to the success of voluntary actions, whereof the greatest part of our lives is made up, and by which we are conducted through different courses to different ends. I shall endeavor to show both from experience and the reason of the thing. When a man is perfectly content with the state he is in, which is when he is perfectly without any uneasiness, what industry, what action, what will is there left but to continue in it? Of this every man's observation will satisfy him. And thus we see all our all-wise Maker, suitable to our constitution and frame, and knowing what it is that determines the will, has put into man the uneasiness of hunger and thirst, and our natural desires that return at their seasons to move and determine their will for the preservation of themselves and the continuation of their species. For I think we may conclude that if the bare contemplation of these good ends, to which we are carried by these several uneasinesses, had been sufficient to determine the will and set on us work, we should have had none of these natural pains, and perhaps in this world little or no pain at all. It is better to marry than to burn, says St. Paul, where we may see what it is that chiefly drives men into the enjoyments of a conjugal life. A little burning felt pushes us more powerfully than great pleasures in prospect, draw, or lure. So maybe like a kind of a Protestant work ethic here. The guilt and shame that we feel, the uneasiness that we feel at our laziness drives us into industry and productivity. Those who are lazy, therefore, have no pains. And we can see this in the United States. The groups which have the lowest levels of depression are the least industrious. Those who have the greatest, how should we say this? Those who have the greatest levels of depression and suicide in America are also those groups which have the greatest industry. It seems so established and settled a maxim by the general content of all mankind that good, the greater good, determines the will, that I do not at all wonder that when I first published my thoughts on this subject, I took it for granted, and I imagine that by a great many I shall be thought more excusable for having then done so, than that now I have ventured to recede from so received an opinion. But yet upon a stricter enquiry, I am forced to conclude that good, the greater good, though apprehended and acknowledged to be so, does not determine the will until our desire raised proportionably to it makes us uneasy in the want of it. Convince a man never so much that plenty has its advantages over poverty. Make him see and own that the handsome conveniences of life are better than nasty penury. Yet as long as he is content with the latter and finds no uneasiness in it, he moves not. His will never is determined to any action that shall bring him out of it. Let a man be never so well persuaded of the advantages of virtue, that it is as necessary to a man who has any great aims in the world or hopes in the next as food to life. Yet till he hungers and thirsts after righteousness, till he feels an uneasiness in the want to it, his will not be determined to any action in pursuit of this confessed greater good. But any other uneasiness he feels in himself shall take place and carry his will to other actions. On the other side, let a drunkard see that his health decays, his estate wastes, discredit, and diseases, and the want of all things, even of his beloved drink, attends him in the course he follows. Yet the returns of uneasiness to miss his companions, the habitual thirst after his cups at the usual time, drives him to the tavern, though he has in his view the loss of health and plenty, and perhaps of the joys of another life, the least of which is no inconsiderable good, but such as he confesses is far greater than the tickling of his palate with a glass of wine or the idle chat of a soaking club. 'Tis not for want of viewing the greater good, for he sees and acknowledges it, and in the intervals of his drinking hours will take resolutions to pursue the greater good. But when the uneasiness to miss his accustomed delight returns, the greater acknowledged good loses its hold, and the present uneasiness determines the will to the accustomed action, which thereby gets stronger footing to prevail against the next occasion, though he at the same time makes secret promises to himself that he will do so no more, that this is the last time he will act against the attainment of those greater goods. And thus he is from time to time in the state of that unhappy complainer, video meliora proboque deteriora sequor, which sentence allowed for true and made good by constant experience, may this and possibly no other way be easily made intelligible. If we inquire into the reason of what experience makes so evident in fact, and examine why 'tis uneasiness alone operates on the will and determines it in its choice, we shall find that we being capable but of one determination of the will to one action at once, the present uneasiness that we are under does naturally determine the will in order to that happiness which we all aim at in our actions. For as much as whilst we are under any uneasiness, we cannot apprehend ourselves happy, or in the way to it, pain and uneasiness being by everyone concluded and felt to be inconsistent with happiness, spoiling the relish even of those good things which we have, a little pain serving to mar all the pleasure we rejoiced in. And therefore, that which of course determines the choice of our will to the next action will always be the removing of pain, as long as we have any left as the first and necessary step toward happiness. Another reason why 'tis uneasiness alone determines the will may be this, because that alone is present and 'tis against the nature of things that what is absent should operate where it is not, and may be said that absent good may by contemplation be brought home to the mind and made present. The idea of it indeed may be in the mind and viewed as present there, but nothing will be in the mind as a present good, able to counterbalance the removal of any uneasiness which we are under till it raises our desire, and the uneasiness of that has the prevalency in determining the will. Till then, the idea of the mind of whatever good is there only like other ideas, the object of bare unactive speculation, but operates not in the will, nor sets us on work, the reason whereof I shall show by and by. How many are to be found that have had lively representations set before their minds of the unspeakable joys of heaven, which they acknowledge both possible and probable too, who yet would be content to take up their happiness here, and so the prevailing uneasiness of their desires, let loose after the enjoyments of this life, take their turns in the determining their wills, and all that while they take not one step, are not one jot moved towards the good things of another life, considered as ever so great. Were the will determined by the views of good, as it appears in contemplation, greater or less to the understanding, which is the state of all absent good, and that which the received opinion the will is supposed to move to, and to be moved by, I do not see how it could ever get loose from the infinite eternal joys of heaven once proposed and considered as possible. For all absent good, by which alone barely proposed and coming in view, the will is thought to be determined, and so to set us on action, being only possible, but not infallibly certain, 'tis unavoidable that the infinitely greater possible good should regularly and constantly determine the will in all the successive actions it directs, and then we should keep constantly and steadily in our course towards heaven, without ever standing still or directing our actions to any other end. The eternal condition of a future state infinitely outweighing the expectation of riches or honor or any other worldly pleasure which we can propose to ourselves, though we should grant these the more probable to be attained. For nothing future is yet in possession, and so the expectation even of these may deceive us. If it were so that the greater good in view determines the will, so great a good once proposed could not but seize the will and hold it fast to the pursuit of this infinitely greatest good, without ever letting it go again. For the will, having a power over and directing the thoughts as well as other actions, would, if it were so, hold the contemplation of the mind fixed to that good. This would be the state of the mind and regular tendency of the will in all its determinations, were it determined by that which is considered and in view of the greater good. But that it is not so is visible in experience, the infinitely greatest confessed good being often neglected to satisfy the successive uneasiness of our desires pursuing trifles. But though the greatest allowed even everlasting unspeakable good, which has sometimes moved and affected the mind, does not steadfastly hold the will, yet we see any very great and prevailing uneasiness having once laid hold on the will, lets it not go, by which we may be convinced that it is that determines the will. What it is that determines the will. Thus, any vehement pain of the body, the ungovernable passion of a man violently in love, or the impatient desire of revenge keeps the will steady and intent. And the will thus determined never lets the understanding lay by the object, but all the thoughts of the mind and the powers of the body are uninterruptedly employed that way, by the determinations of the will, influenced by that topping uneasiness as long as it lasts, whereby it seems to me evident that the will or power of setting us upon one action in preference to all others is determined in us by uneasiness, and whether this be not so, I desire everyone to observe in himself. I have hitherto chiefly instanced in the uneasiness of desire as that which determines the will, because that is the chief and most sensible, and the will seldom orders any action, nor is there any voluntary action performed without some desire accompanying it, which I think is the reason why the will and desire are so often confounded. But yet we are not to look upon the uneasiness which makes up, or at least accompanies, most of the other passions as wholly excluded in the case. Aversion, fear, anger, envy, shame, etc. have each their uneasiness too, and thereby influence the will. These passions are scarce any of them in life and practice, simple and alone, and wholly unmixed with others, though usually in discourse and contemplation that carries the name which operates strongest and appears most in the present state of the mind. Nay, there is, I think, scarce any of the passions to be found without desire joined with it. I am sure wherever there is uneasiness, there is desire. For we constantly desire happiness, and whatever we feel of uneasiness, so much 'tis certain we want of happiness. Even in our own opinion, let our state and condition otherwise be what it will. Besides the present moment not being our eternity, whatever our enjoyment be, we look beyond the present, and desire goes with our forfight, and that still carries the will with it. So that even in joy itself, that which keeps up the action, whereon the enjoyment depends, it is the desire to continue it and fear to lose it. And whenever a greater uneasiness than that takes place in the mind, the will is presently by that determined to some new action, and the present delight neglected. But we being in this world beset with sundry uneasinesses, distracted with different desires, the next enquiry naturally will be, which of them has the precedency in determining the will to the next action? And to that the answer is, that ordinarily, which is the most pressing of those that are judged capable of being then removed. For the will, being the power of directing our operative faculties to some action for some end, cannot at any time be moved towards what is judged at that time unattainable. That would be to suppose an intelligent being designedly to act for an end, only to lose its labor. For so it is to act for what is judged not attainable, and therefore very great uneasinesses move not the will when they are judged not capable of a cure. They in that case put us not upon endeavors, but these set apart the most important and urgent uneasinesses we at that time feel, is that which ordinarily determines the will successively in that train, choo-choo, of voluntary actions which make up our lives. The greatest present uneasiness is the spur to action that is constantly felt, and for the most part determines the will in its choice of the next action. For this we must carry along with us that the proper and only object of the will is some action of ours and nothing else. For we producing nothing by our own willing, but some action in our power, 'tis there the will terminates and reaches no farther. If it be farther asked what 'tis moves desire, I answer, happiness, and that alone. Happiness and misery are the names of two extremes, the utmost bounds whereof we know not. 'Tis what eye hath not seen, ear hath not heard, nor hath it entered into the heart of man to conceive. But of some degrees of both we have very lively impressions, made by several instances of delight and joy on the one side, and torment and sorrow on the other, which for shortness' sake I shall comprehend under the names of pleasure and pain, there being pleasure and pain of the mind as well as the body. With him is fullness of joy and pleasure forevermore. Or to speak truly, they are all of the mind, though some have their rise in the mind from thought, others in the body from certain modifications of motion. Happiness, then, in its full extent, is the utmost pleasure we are capable of, and misery the utmost pain. And the lowest degree of what can be called happiness is so much ease from all pain, and so much present pleasure, as without which anyone cannot be content. Let me check on... Chat has cut off previous messages. Okay, so because the chat is cutting off previous messages, I will check now what the previous messages were. Thank you for letting me know, moderator fourth density. True, but Roger Federer is about to enter the billionaire class. Oh, he is. Thanks again, Ken. Sir Roger, the prince from Basel, so hot right now. Smooth Operator by Sade is a way better argument for mercantilist liberalism than anything Locke ever wrote. When you think it's somebody keeps going, LOL. What face? Flushed face. Everyone in this chat is a natural aristocrat. True, we are serfs. Kenneth is our aristocrat. The Jokkull Lodge. I agree with 4D. We are all aristocrats. Ken, I think you need some vitamin D supplementation. Yakub recommends daily vitamin D supplementation for the melanin deficient. Ignore Yakub at your peril. Everyone should watch Bart Ehrman versus Michael Brown, Ken's uncle, on Suffering. We are on lockdown, lock her up. This stream would have a lot more panache if you could read it in one of those old school white wigs. Look, if you go to DLive and you donate, you go to Amazon and you find out what's the cost of a white wig, maybe $10, maybe, Amazon, I'm pretty sure you could find a white wig, but it would be uncomfortable. It would be itchy. I would want to take it off. But I would wear, if someone wants to pay the money to purchase a white wig on DLive, then I will be happy to go, buy a white wig. And of course, it'll take some time. It's shipping and handling, but I will wear the white wig for some period of time. You can do it, Ken. You have our support. I'm ready, locked, and loaded. Wigs and other such articles are not conducive to the Wojak archetype. Kenneth projects into the digital realm. This archetype has an important function. It is the tabula rasa which we build upon. Well, shouldn't I shave my head if I'm going to be Wojak? Whenever I put in a comment, there is a part of me that makes me feel like I'm forced to stay out of politeness. Sensation, reflection, compounding, repetition, modifications, mind modes of thinking, ideas, God, cause the bishop is reading. If that was true, fourth D, he would not be wearing such stylish Abercrombie & Fitch shirts. They are indeed very provocative shirts. All right, see you fellows when Jokkull comes back. Hopefully Kenneth sums up this up or drops small nuggets of knowledge he gleaned from this exercise. Lots of arms showing on some of those streams. The subtle V-neck may go over the typical watcher's head. Roger versus Greta. That feud goes back longer than we could imagine. Roger's pretty trad. Double twins, mommy GF, virility personified. Greta, on the other hand, empty can of beans. That's it. Tennis is a trad sport. Djokovic is a Orthodox Christian who's pretty vocal in his faith. Tennis also makes the sex dichotomy in sports starkly evident. Nadal is a localist loyal to his family and home. I will force my children to play tennis, I've already decided. Roger is instinctively trad, a warrior general. Djokovic has a heavy perennialist vibe where he mixes orthodoxy with New Age and other Eastern traditions, a warrior priest. What about Rafael Nadal? Nadal is one for who war is the ultimate purpose. He would die early but in glory. Yeah, Rafael Nadal does look like Brad Pitt in that movie playing Achilles. Very honorably, honestly, probably the most honorable of the three. Whoever mocks Locke gets an electric shock and then socked at the docks and falls into a sharp rock, and then it's a matter of tick-tock before the crows flock to knock pox in his block. I don't know what his block is. To the polling booth, 1,000 plus Reddit point received, yeet yeet. Does Kenneth's voice not go sore? Relentless orator. Rumor goes Locke would listen to Bach while dunking on jocks with his brainy ad hocs. I am simply too dull to understand a 50-page exhortation upon the idea of bulk. Message retracted from Napoleonov. Very sad. Priestly tricks and status signal. It's like, guys, if you're going to make a comment, commit. Like, think before you make a comment. This isn't to Napoleonov. This is to everybody. Think before you make a comment. Never say anything and then be like, never mind. It's like you stand by your words. Be a man of your words here. Priestly tricks and status signaling are indeed in the Lockean tradition. Or even more intelligent viewers still will generally tune out Locke and survey the comments while working. All of that can be said about any philosophical work. Media is popular because it contains the juicy parts of the work combined with the sports-like domain of character competition. It's a type of pornography, but that doesn't necessarily make it bad. This is just masochism at this point. Nietzsche's work is perhaps one of the only that doesn't have this effect in and of itself because of its poetic and playful nature. He takes pornography and consciously uses it. Next, you have stolen my listening. How dare you? The funny thing is, Sargon was presumably talking about two treatises of government, not this book, but I kind of doubt he read that either. Synchronicity between tennis and Locke. God truly is with us. I, too, think Sargon only pretends to read books to get patrons. Nietzschean stylistic choice is a form of priestly self-loathing and attempt at self-negation. Liberty consists of one's ability to exercise his will according to his preference, and this is how we arrive at 2020. Liberty is a market construct. The slave is free at the moment he becomes a masochist, making a cynical joke. All you need to do is convince yourself that the splinter in your finger is actually a good thing, and then before you know it, you will be liberated from your suffering. Nowhere is this made more explicit than in Christianity, where to suffer and die in the service of God by Christ's example is the highest of virtues. There is no escape from pleasure. Freedom from pleasure offers its own jouissance, though in reality, liberated man seeks not freedom from pleasure, but slavery to it. Hey, I have a few jokes about unemployed people, but none of them work. None of them work, you get it, because, like, the unemployed have no job. Why don't they work? Because, like, When you have no job, you don't work, 'tis true. Yeah, it's funny. Wait, so are you unemployed? No, it was a joke. Trump supporter detected. President Trump is not my president. You're going to have to start from the beginning because I have no American citizenship. Still waiting for Uncle Mehmed to print me one. Okay, this troll, he's on my list right now. He's on notice. T minus 10 minutes before you get banned by Ken Imperator. Last night I dreamed I was swimming in an ocean of orange soda, but it was just a fantasy. Oh boy, two windmills are standing in a wind farm. One asks, what's your favorite kind of music? The other says, I'm a big metal fan. I feel a psychosexual buildup of energy leading to the end of this book. My thighs subtly tremble. I think you meant to say tremble subtly. A mathematician wanders back home at 3 a.m. and proceeds to get an earful from his battle axe of a wife. You're late, she yells. You said you'd be home by 11:45. Actually, the mathematician replies coolly, I said I'd be home by 11:45. Nearly page 200. Ken is doing well. W. I'll take a W. Thank you, John Smith. Concerned for my health. 21 likes, 13 viewers. Doing pretty well. You're doing pretty well. Okay, we got to finish up with the chat and then skedaddle. Actually, okay. Michael, I don't understand. Oh, now I understand. Massive laughter. Roaring applause. I guess I should join Mensa. We both should. I hope this person reading this stuff will read our juicy jokes later. He will. So if you have more good ones, you should definitely post them. My dad farted in an elevator. It was wrong on so many levels. I don't get it because elevator goes up and down. Genius. My joints don't crack. Is that bad? The 4th message retracted. Very sad. Jesus wouldn't like you to have joints. Message retracted. What the hell? A police officer just knocked on my door and told me my dogs are chasing people on bikes. That's ridiculous. My dogs don't even own bikes. Okay, that was funny. Rodney Dangerfield has graced the chat tonight. You meant to say every single one of mine was funny. Why do dogs always bark when somebody rings the doorbell? It almost never for them. The bulk of this page lifts. He should be reading the big letters louder, I think. Here you can see distorting the pages. The book approaches its zenith. Dude, we're not even in the climax yet. That's how it would be more correct. And Michael, I don't know. My dogs bark just once before dinner. Nick Land's head is trying to come out of this page like an alien chest burster. Oh, you're a moderator. Good. I have a question. What will I be banned for? Is it allowed to be misogynistic here? Forbidden. What? We are radical egalitarian. Strict cooperation with YouTube guidelines and Ken's bad words blacklist is required. You're doing well. That's so awful. Have you even read Locke? I don't even know who Ken is. No, but I watched some of him in one of the first seasons of Lost. If you like the stream, you get a little more slack. There is no slack. There is only boot. I don't know what you two mean. 4th has a fetish for exacting his moderating power on YouTube chats. Don't give him the pleasure. I can please him with my sophisticated jokes. Did you hear about the one about the elevator? You should internalize the society of discipline and self-flagellate for even thinking to post something vile. We are weak here, though. Message retractions are arguably worse than keeping silent. Agree. I don't understand half of the words you use, so I guess I'll just agree. This is the longest chapter of all time. Look up the extremely online dictionary for clarification. Oh, right, that boy is still reading stuff. I forgot. Too much effort. 4th. The potentiality of punishing someone titillates me far more than actually doing it. I've done it only once so far. You deleted one of my messages. I have it on good authority. Oh boy, that was some awful Latin. I apologize. I remember it wasn't anything vile. I was merely annoyed it won't happen again. Poor Michael. He just said something about something. I support gays and find your act homophobic. I forgive you after some self-flagellation. In reality, I was annoyed with myself and ended up lashing out on you. It was an expression of my own need for the boot I have learned. What a great journey with a good moral. I'm deeply touched. I like Locke when he's dealing in examples. He should have wrote fiction. Yes, very redemptive. Anglos speak with fairy tales, not just Anglos forefight, more like foresight. More like foresight, start over. Chat has cut off some previous messages post-economically, so Ken can read all the posts as he likes to. I wish he will. England doesn't have a kidney bank, but it does have a Liverpool. Alex Jones just carried Richard Spencer to MLK. LMFAO. Absolutely based. What are your favorite video games? I like Anamita Design, which is a gaming company out of Czech Republic. I liked a guy named Mateusz Skutnik, who is an architect. He started making Flash games from Poland. I could post those in the chat, perhaps. If I get my keyboard assorted here, I got to kind of move things around. But give me a moment here. Mateusz Skutnik. And might have spelled it wrong. It's Polish. Mateusz Skutnik. I will post a link to his website. I haven't played him in a while, so I don't know if he still makes Flash games or what he's doing, because I know Flash support is ending. Amanita Design, and this is amanitadesign.net. Let's see if they're still out and about. I'll post that link there. So those are two off the top of my head. Of course, there are many others, but those are the ones that come. Of course, you got popular ones like Minecraft or whatever. You also have Cactus Squid. Let's see if I can pull up Cactus Squid. cactussquid.blogspot.com. These are some of the game designers back in the day, indie art-based game designers that I liked back in the day. Haven't played many games other than Minecraft in the last couple of years. Shrek 2 on PC. His block is on his head in Knock Your Block Off. I retract comments if I decide they weren't as good as I initially thought, but I'll take your advice. Try to think before I post so I can be proud and never feel the need to retract. Posting comments changes the perspective on the post. I feel bad for what I said now, LO. Didn't know you'd really read it later. My apologies. Wonderful. Made it through the chat. Got to... Time to go hit the weights. All right, everybody. Time to go hit the weights. Have a wonderful evening. Have a wonderful day. Have a wonderful life. We will continue, Locke. We made it to page 157 out of 427. We are over the hill, and we will continue on next time, hopefully, to reach page 300. Till then, we'll read more about happiness and misery and all of those good things. It will be wonderful. Remember to like the video. We currently have 22 likes and 12 concurrent viewers. We're always our goal. We're trying to get more likes than viewers. So just come into the stream, hit that like button, and then go back to doing whatever you're doing. It was a good 3-hour, 35-minute stream. And I will now take my leave. And I will now go do other things, as you should. No, it's his head, not on his head. Goodbye. So long. Farewell. Auf Wiedersehen. Tschüss. Das Vidania. What other words for goodbye do I know? I don't know that I know a whole lot of words for goodbye, to be honest. But bye, Ken. Goodbye, Napoleonov. Have a good one. Stay Lockean.